birth of Rome. Before the emperors, before the invincible armies, before the Colosseum and the legions marching to the edges of the world, there was a hill surrounded by swamps, covered in trees and rocks, lashed by the winds of central Italy. In that still wild landscape, with the Tiber flowing like an artery that did not yet know it would feed a historical monster, a group of precarious huts, made of wood and mud, began to take shape. No one at the time could have imagined that this small community would become the capital of an empire that would span 3 continents and define, for more than 1,000 years, the course of Western civilization. And yet, there it was, quietly being born, while the great powers of the era, such as Egypt, Assyria, or Greece, were immersed in their own games of domination. Rome did not emerge like a lightning bolt. It was a carefully tended ember, fueled by myths, wars, and alliances. There were no gods descending from the heavens or oracles announcing its rise. What there was, however, was a powerful story, woven with symbols, blood, and willpower. That story begins with a legend, one still repeated today like a kind of pagan prayer. Romulus and Remus, twins born from the womb of a Vestal virgin, sons of the god Mars, abandoned in a basket on the riverbank. A she-wolf, a real she-wolf, according to some, or a prostitute nicknamed that way according to others, suckled them in a cave on the Palatine Hill. 2 children saved by the beast, raised by shepherds, turned into men by destiny. It does not matter how deeply the archaeologist digs or how much the historian doubts. Rome cannot be separated from this founding image, because it is a city that chose to be born from violence, from conflict, from fratricide. When the twins decide to found a city, each wants to name it after himself. Romulus traces a furrow with a plow, marking the sacred boundary of his future city. Remus mocks him. He jumps over the furrow, and then his brother kills him. Thus, the first political act of Rome is a murder. The legend does not hide it. It glorifies it. From the beginning, Rome presents itself as a ruthless, determined creature, capable of placing order above the deepest bond, blood. But beyond the myth, there is archaeological evidence supporting the existence of an organized community around the middle of the 8th century before Christ. Excavations on the Palatine Hill have revealed remains of dwellings, rudimentary structures, and a necropolis. A village of shepherds, no doubt, but not an insignificant place. The site had strategic advantages. It was located at the exact point where the Tiber could be crossed on foot, and at the same time, it was easily defended thanks to its hills. It was far enough from the sea to avoid pirate attacks, but close to crucial trade routes. Around that first Rome, other villages began to cluster, and little by little, almost organically, a city was born. Not by design, but by necessity. A community that needed to organize itself to survive. And with organization came power. According to tradition, Rome had 7 kings. Romulus, the first, not only founded the city, he created institutions. He established the Senate, made up of 100 patres, the fathers of the future patrician families who would dominate politics for centuries. He also organized the army and founded an asylum on the Capitoline Hill, where he welcomed refugees, slaves, and criminals. He did not do it out of compassion, but out of calculation. Rome needed people, and it did not care where they came from. But if Rome had men, it needed women. This is where the famous episode of the abduction of the Sabine women appears. During a festival, the Romans invite their neighbors, the Sabines, and in the middle of the celebration, they seize their women. A brutal story, no doubt, but one that ends in reconciliation. The Sabine women, now wives of Romans, intercede between their fathers and their husbands, and the 2 communities unite. It is an allegory of what Roman politics would always be: conquest followed by integration. The second king, Numa Pompilius, represents the opposite. If Romulus was the warrior, Numa is the priest. Under his reign, Rome became religiously structured. Priesthood colleges were created, official rituals established, and the lunar calendar introduced. The foundations of the worship of the gods were laid. Gods who would later justify wars, alliances, and political decisions. Religion was not a private matter. It was a matter of the state. With Tullus Hostilius, Rome returned to war. He defeated Alba Longa, its former metropolis, and absorbed its inhabitants. It is the time of the story of the Horatii and the Curiatii, two trios of brothers who fight on behalf of their cities. 3 against 3. Only one survives. The family does not matter. The homeland does. The next king, Ancus Martius, expanded the territory westward and founded Ostia, the first Roman port. Controlling access to the sea meant controlling trade, salt, and resources. Rome began to look beyond its hills. It began to think of itself as more than just a city. And then the Etruscans arrived. Tarquinius Priscus, the first of them, introduced urban improvements, draining the swamps, building temples, and a circus for competitions. Rome ceased to be a fortified village and became a city-state with stone buildings and walls. Then Servius Tullius reorganized society. He created a census, divided citizens into classes according to their wealth, and established a new form of assembly. The city became bureaucratic. It became disciplined. But with Tarquinius Superbus, the last king, came arrogance and unchecked violence. He ruled without respecting the Senate, repressed his enemies, and built grand temples to hide his unpopularity. And then came the crime that changed everything. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, a Roman noblewoman. Humiliated, she took her own life, and her death ignited the revolution. The people rose up, the patricians organized, the king was expelled, and a vow was made never to have another. The Republic was born. But that moment will be addressed later. Here in this first part, what matters is the following. Rome has been born. It has moved from myth to city, from plow to temple, from tribe to politics. It has done so through wars, alliances, religion, and power. What is fascinating is that from the very beginning, Rome was not built as a closed society. It was mixed, ambitious, adaptable. It took from the Sabines, from the Etruscans, from the Latins. It learned, copied, transformed. That ability to absorb what was foreign without losing its identity is what made it so dangerous and so enduring. The Republican Revolution. Rome had expelled its last king, Tarquinius the Proud, and with him, a period marked by despotism, imposition, and the cult of power as a divine inheritance came to an end. What began now was not a simple transition of leadership. It was a profound rupture, a political gesture that would have consequences for centuries. Because in the year 509 before Christ, Rome did not merely change rulers, it reinvented itself from the ground up. The Republic was, in its purest essence, an unprecedented experiment in the Western world. It was not a modern democracy, of course, nor a disguised oligarchy. It was a constantly evolving system, a political machine driven by the tension between classes, interests, ambitions, and traditions. It was not born perfect. It was born conflicted. And that friction was, paradoxically, what kept it alive for nearly 500 years. The immediate trigger of the revolution had been the outrage committed against Lucretia, a noblewoman whose violation at the hands of the king's son ignited the indignation of the Roman elites. Her suicide was not only an act of personal grief, but also a public declaration that honor stood above life itself. That death transformed into a symbol, lit a spark that could no longer be extinguished. Lucius Junius Brutus, the king's nephew and one of the first consuls of the new republic, led the uprising. Tarquinius was exiled, and with him, the entire monarchy. From that moment on, Rome adopted a radically different structure. Power would no longer lie in the hands of a lifelong king, but in two consuls elected annually. Two men of equal rank, with the ability to veto each other, destined to prevent power from concentrating. This balance of power was the heart of the Republic. The goal was not for the people to rule, but to ensure that no single man could rule alone. But that vision of equilibrium did not hide the underlying tensions. In Rome, society was deeply divided between patricians and plebeians. The former were descendants of the founding families, landowners, holders of religious privileges, and the only ones with access to the highest offices of the state. The latter, the majority, were free citizens, farmers, artisans, soldiers, but without any real voice in government decisions. This inequality would soon become a constant source of conflict. The first decades of the Republic were marked by what historians call the conflict of the orders, a series of social confrontations that forced the elites to gradually yield power to the lower classes. The first major milestone was the creation of the Tribune of the Plebs, a position established to defend the interests of the people against the Senate and the consuls. The tribunes had a special power, the ability to intervene, to protect any citizen against injustice, and even to veto official decisions, and their person was inviolable, which meant that anyone who dared to harm them was cursed by law. This office changed the political game forever. The plebeians, who until then had served only as cannon fodder in wars or as taxpayers without representation, were beginning to have a real channel of influence. It was not a total revolution, but it was a crack in the patrician wall. Over time, more concessions would come. In the year 450 before Christ, the 12 Tables were written, Rome's first codified set of laws. Until then, the law had been oral, transmitted by the priests, and easily manipulated by the powerful. With these bronze tablets, displayed in the Forum, any citizen could know their rights and duties. It was a gesture of transparency, but also of social control. Knowing the law meant being able to demand it. But the conflicts did not end there. The plebeians wanted more. Access to the consulship, to religious positions, to public lands. They wanted their marriages with patricians to be legally recognized. They wanted to stop being second-class citizens. And they did not ask for it. They demanded it. At times, they even imposed it by force. On more than one occasion, the plebeians left the city en masse, what became known as the secession of the plebs, leaving Rome without labor, without soldiers, without life. It was a social blackmail of epic proportions, and it worked. Each of these crises forced reforms. New magistracies were created, such as the aedile or the quaestor, who helped organize urban life and manage the state's finances. Eventually, plebeians were allowed to access the consulship, though only after decades of struggle. Rome did not take false steps, but neither did it move quickly. Its way of changing was stubborn. It built up pressure until it could no longer withstand it, and then gave way, but without losing its basic structure. Amid this institutional growth, Rome began to define its political identity. The Senate, composed of the most experienced former magistrates, became established as the body of deliberation and moral authority. It had no direct executive power, but its influence was so profound that, in practice, it decided the Republic's course. The people voted in assemblies, yes, but it was the Senate that guided the decisions. That combination of popular consultation and aristocratic dominance was another of Rome's peculiarities, an imperfect but effective mixture of aristocracy and participation. Meanwhile, the army did not lag behind. In Rome, being a citizen meant being a soldier. A professional army did not yet exist. Each campaign was a call to arms. The consuls led the legions, made up of farmers who laid down their plows to take up swords. But as Rome expanded, so did its military apparatus. The wars for control of Latium, the campaigns against the Volscians, the Equians, the Sabines, and other Italic peoples required more precise organization. The army became an extension of politics. Military glory guaranteed prestige, votes, and social advancement. This entire process of political construction was guided by a central idea. Rome was a sacred community. The city was not only a physical structure, but also a pact between the gods, the citizens, and history. Every institution had a religious meaning. Every act of government was wrapped in rituals. Consulting the augurs before any major decision was not superstition, it was duty. Rome did not conceive of itself as a secular republic. It was a consecrated republic. And so, through internal disputes, gradual reforms, legal battles, and military campaigns, Rome defined a unique model. A republic without precedent, with written rules, tribunes who vetoed laws, consuls who alternated power, a senate that decided without commanding, and a people who voted without fully ruling. It was a complex machine, fragile and powerful at the same time, capable of withstanding crises without collapsing and of adapting without losing its essence. The most striking thing is that this system was not designed by philosophers nor drafted by intellectuals. It was the result of necessity, of conflict, of political survival. Rome never imagined itself as ideal. It imagined itself as possible, and in that possibility, it found its strength. When we look today at the beginnings of the Roman Republic, we do so with the clarity that distance provides. We know that this system was not eternal. We know that over time, the accumulated tensions would make the structure explode from within. But at that moment, in the centuries that followed the overthrow of Tarquinius, Rome became more than a city with ambition. It became an idea. That power can be shared, that government does not have to depend on a single figure, that history can be written from confrontation and not from obedience. And if the Republic was built as a bastion against tyranny, it also unknowingly prepared itself to be the stage for the greatest personal ambitions in history. Because what will come next is expansion. Wars for the domination of Italy, the clash with Carthage, and the transformation of Rome into a superpower. All of that begins to take shape now, while the Senate debates, the tribunes challenge the consuls, and the citizens go armed with both spears and laws. The next step will be the clash with the outside world. Rome no longer fights for itself. It fights to dominate. And on that path, the Republic will once again have to adapt, or be dragged down by the consequences of its own power. The Conquest of Italy. When Rome managed to consolidate its republic, when the echo of the exiled kings was already a distant memory and the institutions began to function like a disciplined machine, the city faced a new necessity: expansion. Not out of an abstract desire for greatness, but for a simpler and more urgent reason. It was surrounded by enemies. Rome could not afford to stop. If it ceased to advance, others would devour it. And thus, what at first was self-defense ended up becoming conquest. Italy, in the centuries following the fall of the Roman monarchy, was an unstable mosaic. Mountain tribes, city-states, agricultural peoples, Greek colonies, allied or rival confederations. Latins, Sabines, Etruscans, Volsci, Samnites, Umbrians, Lucanians. A multitude of fragmented identities, each with its own dialect, gods, laws, and ambitions. There was no dominant power. No one could exert control over the entire peninsula, until Rome began to do so. But Roman expansion was not the result of a master plan or an early imperial vision. At first, these were limited campaigns, tactical responses, wars provoked by broken alliances, border ambushes, or deliberate provocations. It was like a game of chess with no script, where each victory brought new challenges, and each challenge forced Rome to reorganize, adapt, and keep pushing forward. The first step on that path was the war against the Etruscans. These peoples, who had ruled Rome during the final phase of its monarchy, were still powerful in the north of Latium and beyond. Some of their cities, such as Veii, represented a direct threat to Rome. After years of intermittent clashes, the war turned total. The siege of Veii was long, costly, and forced the Romans to perfect their military craft. When it finally fell, Rome gained not only one less enemy, but also a vast amount of fertile land, a new kind of loot, and a huge injection of prestige. As Rome subdued neighboring peoples, it was forced to develop a model of integration. And what it did was ingenious. It did not completely destroy its enemies, but rather turned them into subordinate allies. These alliances, often imposed under pressure, forced the defeated peoples to provide soldiers and resources, while Rome reserved political control for itself. Thus was born what is known as the Latin Confederation, a network of cities connected by oaths, pacts, and war commitments. Rome, not entirely by design, was building a stable form of hegemony. But expansion was not without crisis. The war against the Samnites was one of the toughest and most prolonged conflicts the Republic faced in its early phase. The Samnites, proud mountain people from the central southern part of Italy, were a warlike, agile people, difficult to confront in open battle. For nearly half a century, Roman legions fought against them in a series of clashes known as the Samnite Wars. It was during these wars that Rome suffered one of the bitterest humiliations in its history. At the Caudine Forks, its troops were forced to pass naked under a yoke, a symbol of submission. For any other city, it would have been a fatal blow. For Rome, it was fuel. They swore revenge, and they fulfilled it. These wars were a laboratory for Rome. Here, new strategies were tested, military formations were perfected, roads were built, the famous Roman roads, to facilitate movement, and military colonies were established in key points to control rebellious territories. The legions became a political tool as powerful as the Senate or the assemblies. War ceased to be a reaction and became a method of government. Rome also understood that conquering Italy was not just about defeating enemies. It meant administering, occupying, persuading, dividing. Many peoples were not loyal to Rome, but were greater enemies among themselves. The Republic knew how to exploit those mutual hatreds to forge temporary alliances, promise privileges, and then impose obedience. Roman politics, even at this early stage, already showed its capacity to play on multiple boards at once. The defeat of the Samnites opened the door to the south. And there, Rome found something different: the Greek cities. In Magna Graecia, the southern part of the peninsula and eastern Sicily, cities like Tarentum, Croton, Syracuse flourished. Wealthy, sophisticated, allied to or colonies of Hellenic polis, they represented a different model of civilization, older, more advanced in some respects, and also prouder. The Greeks were not willing to submit to a city that, in their view, was still semi-barbaric. The war against Tarentum marked a new stage. It was here that Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, a distant relative of Alexander the Great, appeared. He came with elephants, with phalanxes, with refined tactics that Rome had never faced. And he won battles. Several. But his victories were so costly that Pyrrhic victories were born, triumphs that wear down the victor more than the vanquished. Rome, like an oak battered by storms, bent but did not break. It learned while fighting. It adapted even in defeat. When Pyrrhus withdrew and Tarentum fell, Rome had completed its control over the entire peninsula. From the Arno River in the north to the Strait of Messina in the south, from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, the Republic was already the dominant power. But it was not a formal empire. There was no unified model of governance over Italy. Each region had its own status. Some were allies, others colonies, others had partial citizenship. Everything depended on timing, negotiation, or fear. And yet, despite that diversity, Italy was beginning to revolve around Rome. Roads branched out from the Forum in all directions. Tributes began to flow toward the city. Latin, although not imposed, began to displace other languages in administration. Roman gods were invoked alongside local deities. Rome, without proclaiming it, was Italianizing Italy. This phase of expansion left deep marks on Roman identity. It strengthened the idea that power had to grow or die. That war was a natural state. That victory was not an end, but a condition for stability. Rome did not conquer out of greed, at least not in its official discourse. It did so out of necessity, for defense, for destiny. This vision, half justification, half prophecy, would be fundamental in the centuries to come. It is also at this moment that the Republic began to feel a latent tension between its internal structure and its external expansion. The city was not designed to govern such a vast territory. The institutions, created for a community of citizens who could gather in the square, now faced the challenge of administering entire provinces. It was as if Rome were growing faster than it could understand itself. But much remained ahead. The peninsula was secured, yes. But when looking across the sea, Rome saw a rival power, a silent enemy that had also grown through commerce, war, and cunning. Carthage, a city with a formidable fleet, immeasurable riches, and dominion over the western Mediterranean. The conquest of Italy had only been the prologue. What would come next would be total war. A struggle for survival between two worlds. Rome was ready to cross the sea. Although it did not fully know it yet, its destiny had already changed forever. The Carthaginian Threat. When Rome finished subjugating Italy, it was not a moment of calm or satisfaction. On the contrary, Rome was stronger, more militarized, with a ruling class thirsty for glory and a people convinced that expansion was part of their destiny. But that growth, which had occurred almost exclusively by land, was about to enter a new dimension. Because beyond the Tyrrhenian Sea, off the southern coast of the peninsula, stood a city that had not been born from the same soil as Rome, nor did it share its rights or language. And yet it possessed something the Romans recognized immediately: power. Carthage, an ancient Phoenician colony turned commercial metropolis, founded according to tradition by Queen Dido centuries before Romulus drew his sacred furrow. A city oriented toward the sea, with wealth accumulated over generations and a fleet capable of dominating routes from the Strait of Gibraltar to the eastern Mediterranean. While Rome expanded through the force of its legions, Carthage did so through mercantile cunning, through treaties, through ports, through the universal language of gold. Two civilizations that had grown without much contact, but that would inevitably end up colliding. And the battlefield would not be Rome or Carthage, but an island at the center of the map: Sicily. The First Punic War broke out in the year 264 before Christ, when a local dispute between Sicilian cities ended up attracting both Romans and Carthaginians. Rome, which until then had no real naval experience, launched into a maritime war against a power that had dominated the seas for centuries. It was a risky, almost suicidal gamble. But Rome, as so often, knew how to turn ignorance into energy. They studied the enemy ships, copied their designs, built entire fleets in record time, and developed a boarding system, the Corvus, that transformed naval battles into land confrontations where the Romans were clearly superior. For more than 2 decades, the two powers clashed in a harsh, exhausting war in which Sicily was devastated again and again. Neither side achieved a definitive victory. Carthage had the fleet, Rome had the obstinacy. At several points, it seemed the war would tilt in favor of the Carthaginians. But Rome, even when it lost ships, men, and money, did not surrender. It rebuilt, recruited, took risks. And in the end, in the year 241 before Christ, After a decisive naval battle in the Aegates Islands, Carthage sued for peace. The treaty was harsh. Carthage had to abandon Sicily, pay a huge indemnity, and accept humiliating conditions. Rome, for its part, wasted no time. It also took Corsica and Sardinia, taking advantage of its former rival's weakness. The First Roman Maritime Empire had been born, and with it, a new era. The administration of provinces, the need for permanent garrisons abroad, the temptation of private profit in wars. But Carthage was not dead, only wounded. And in the silence of its humiliation, it began to prepare. In North Africa, south of the Mediterranean, a new generation of leaders was being formed under the memory of defeat. Among them, one stood out above all. His name would be etched in history as the greatest enemy Rome ever faced. Hannibal Barca. Son of Hamilcar, a Carthaginian general who had fought in Sicily, Hannibal was raised in hatred toward Rome from childhood. Legend says his father took him to the altar and made him swear he would never be a friend of the Romans. Years later, as a commander, Hannibal led Carthaginian expansion in Hispania. There he built a formidable army, not only of Carthaginians, but also of Iberian tribes and mercenaries loyal to his leadership. It was in that setting that he began to plan the unthinkable, a direct invasion of Italy, crossing the Alps with elephants, cavalry, and battle-hardened soldiers. When Hannibal departed from Carthago Nova heading north, no one in Rome could imagine he would succeed. But he did. And he did so in such a bold, devastating way that Roman history changed forever. He crossed the Pyrenees, forded the Rhone, ventured into the Alps in the heart of winter, lost thousands of men along the way, but emerged in northern Italy like an impossible shadow. It was the year 218 before Christ, and Rome had just entered its darkest hour. The Second Punic War was more than a war. It was a nightmare. Hannibal defeated the Romans at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and above all, at Cannae. That battle, which took place in the year 216, was a massacre. Hannibal used a masterful enveloping tactic, surrounding the legions and annihilating them. More than 50,000 Romans died in a single day. It was the worst defeat in all of Roman history. And yet, Rome did not surrender. It did not negotiate. It did not seek a truce. The city entrenched itself, withdrew inward, mobilized every resource, every citizen. Under the command of the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, the Roman army changed strategy. They stopped confronting Hannibal directly, who remained in Italy without sufficient reinforcements, and instead took the war to Hispania and later to Africa. It was a bold move to force Hannibal to abandon Italy to defend his homeland. It worked. In the year 202 before Christ, on the plain of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal in open combat. It was the end of the Second Punic War. Carthage was forced to disarm almost entirely, to cede all its overseas territories, to pay new indemnities, and to renounce any form of war without the permission of Rome. The city continued to exist, but it was a shadow of its former self. Rome, for its part, emerged as an unrivaled superpower. It had survived the greatest threat in its history, had learned to fight on multiple fronts, to manage the logistics of imperial war, and had proven its resilience in the face of despair. But deep down, something had changed. Rome was no longer a republic of citizen soldiers defending their land. It was a power projecting its force toward other continents, dominating by land and sea, demanding tribute and loyalty from Africa to Hispania. Its generals became celebrities. Their victories gave rise to monuments, temples, statues. Military prestige began to turn into political capital. The seeds of Caesarism had already been sown. And still, one last shadow remained on the horizon. Because Carthage, although humiliated, had not been completely destroyed. Some in Rome, like Cato the Elder, knew this. His famous phrase, repeated in every session of the Senate, "Carthage must be destroyed," was not mere obsession. It was political intuition. Sooner or later, Rome would once again look south, and the final war would erupt. The Third Punic War would be brief, brutal, and final. Carthage was besieged for 3 years, and in the year 146 before Christ, the city was annihilated. Its walls were torn down, its inhabitants killed or enslaved, its ruins cursed. Rome had erased its greatest enemy from the map, but it had also crossed a threshold. The republic that had been born to prevent tyranny, the one that claimed to defend freedom against kings, had become an imperial machine. The external enemy had been vanquished. And now, with the Western Mediterranean under control, Rome would have to face a much harder adversary to destroy, its own internal ghosts. And so we approach the next crucial moment. With the Punic Wars concluded and military ambition unleashed, the institutional balance will begin to falter. Because at the heart of Rome, among senators, tribunes, and generals, a silent battle begins to grow for control of power. Blood and ambition in the Republic. After the final defeat of Carthage, Rome became the absolute master of the Western Mediterranean. The sea routes were theirs. The newly conquered lands were filled with colonies and taxes, and the legions returned home with their standards held high, loaded with plunder, slaves, and glory. It seemed like the perfect moment for the flourishing of an invincible republic. But what was underway was something much darker, deeper, and more subtle. An internal transformation that was corroding the essence of the republican system, while everyone applauded the victories. War, which for centuries had been a civic, measured, and defensive activity, became a machine of uncontrolled enrichment. Each campaign brought disproportionate benefits to the generals and their political allies, while the lower classes, who remained the backbone of the army, returned increasingly impoverished. The new provinces, far from being integrated equally, were treated as fiscal reserves. Rome was not exporting citizenship, but hierarchy. And in this new order, those who earned a lot began to want everything. As the treasury of the Republic filled with tributes, the traditional social structures began to fracture. The great landowners, enriched by the wars, bought land at low prices from ruined peasants and turned it into vast estates worked by slaves. In just a few years, a massive number of free citizens, who had once owned small plots and formed the backbone of the army, were expelled from their land. They became a wandering multitude, without property or stable occupation, moving toward Rome, where they waited for something the state no longer knew how to offer: dignity. That mass of the dispossessed was the spark of a new class struggle. But this time, not between patricians and plebeians, as in the early centuries of the Republic, but between the optimates, the traditional aristocracy of the Senate, and the populares, a political faction that claimed to defend the interests of the people, but was in reality a vehicle for personal ambitions. In this context of growing social tension, two figures emerged who tried to change the course of Roman history. Two brothers, noble by birth, but with a cause: Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in the year 133 before Christ. He had a clear idea: to return land to those who had lost it. He proposed an agrarian law that limited the amount of public land one person could own and redistributed the surplus among the poorest citizens. His proposal was not revolutionary in theory, but it was in politics. He was breaking an unwritten rule, directly challenging the landowning aristocracy. The Senate reacted with fury. Tiberius was beaten to death by a mob of senators armed with planks and chair legs. It was the first political assassination in centuries, and with it, a boundary was shattered that would never be restored. 10 years later, his brother Gaius took up the same banner, but with a more ambitious vision. He sought not only agrarian reform, but also the integration of the Italian allies, the distribution of grain at controlled prices, and the creation of colonies abroad to ease social pressure. Gaius was brilliant, a skilled speaker, charismatic, but also more radical than his brother. The conflict intensified. When he tried to run for a third term as tribune, the tension in Rome became unbearable. The Senate, led by figures such as Scipio Nasica, authorized the consul to act so that the Republic would not suffer harm. It was the first formal use of a state of exception. Gaius was pursued, cornered, and took his own life before falling into the hands of his enemies. With the death of the Gracchus brothers, the Republic lost its last chance for peaceful reform. The tensions remained alive, but there was no longer room for agreements. The Senate had become convinced that violence could be used to maintain power, and the popular sectors, increasingly disillusioned, began to look for new leaders capable of guaranteeing them bread, work, and respect, even if it meant breaking the old rules. In that context, different figures emerged. Generals who spoke to the people, who promised glory to their soldiers and security to the displaced. The first of them was Gaius Marius. Of humble origin, Marius became consul 7 times in a row, an unprecedented feat. His great innovation was not only military, but structural. He professionalized the army. Until then, the legions had been made up of property-owning citizens who served temporarily. Marius allowed anyone to enlist, even without land, and offered rewards, plunder, and retirement. The army ceased to be a civic duty and became a career. And with that, the relationship between power and weapons changed forever. Marius was celebrated as a savior after his victories against the Cimbri and Teutons, Germanic peoples who had threatened Italy. But his rise provoked fear in the Senate, which saw in him a new kind of leader, one who answered to the people, not to the aristocracy. The response was Sulla, a conservative patrician, brilliant strategist, determined to restore the traditional order. The conflict between them led to something unprecedented, an open civil war. Sulla, for the first time in Roman history, marched with his legions against Rome itself. It was the year 88 before Christ. The streets of the capital were stained with blood. Sulla's enemies were proscribed, declared outside the law, and killed without trial. The proscription lists were posted publicly, and anyone could kill those listed and claim a reward. It was a time of political terror. Sulla proclaimed himself dictator for an indefinite period, rewrote the laws as he pleased, reinforced the power of the Senate, and then, in an unexpected move, retired. But the damage had already been done. Rome had been ruled by the force of arms, and that, in a republic, is a sign of imminent death. This entire cycle, the frustrated reforms, the institutionalized violence, the rise of ambitious generals, left Rome in a state of permanent fever. No one trusted the laws on their own anymore. Electoral processes were tainted by clientelism, bribery, and threats. The city was full of unemployed people, landless veterans, and slaves in miserable conditions. The Senate, although still powerful, had lost moral authority, and the army no longer obeyed the Republic. It obeyed whoever paid more and promised more. The blood shed in those years was not a temporary excess. It had become the new language of power, and when that language becomes commonplace, it is because something very deep has changed. Rome still called itself a republic, but within, the gears were already those of a dictatorship in the making. The only thing missing was the man who would dare to cross that line completely. But he was about to arrive. The next great protagonist would bring with him an irreversible change. His name would become synonymous with ambition and glory, and the world, from his passage onward, would never be the same. Because with Julius Caesar, Rome would stop asking if it could have a master. It would begin to argue about who that master should be. The rise of the generals, the death of the Gracchus brothers, the dictatorship of Sulla, The army turned into private property. The vetoes, the prescriptions, the legal assassinations, and the concentration of wealth in a few hands had left Rome unrecognizable. Although it was still called a republic, the structure that sustained it was beginning to collapse from within, like a polished facade that, when touched, reveals itself to be hollow. What was coming now was a new kind of leadership, a generation of men who would not grow under the protection of the Senate, nor find legitimacy in the old republican traditions, but would forge their power in military camps, among swords, marches, and victories. They were generals before they were citizens, idols before they were rulers. And in them, Rome would project its final transformation. Gaius Marius had opened the path, and Sulla had crossed it with fury, but they were not the only ones. As the conquests continued, new names emerged with boundless ambition. Roman politics, turned into a war board, was no longer played out in the Forum or the Senate, but on the battlefield, where a victorious general could return as a hero, demand consulships, manipulate laws, bribe votes, and neutralize rivals. The loyalty of the troops was not guaranteed by institutional allegiance, but by promises of land, loot, glory, or mere survival. Whoever controlled the army controlled the power. In this context, a seemingly minor figure appeared. A young man without spectacular lineage, but with political talent, a nose for power, and a charisma that disarmed both the people and the senators. Gnaeus Pompey. His rise was meteoric. He was nicknamed the Teenage Butcher for his brutal military efficiency in the service of Sulla during the civil wars. Without going through the traditional political career, Pompey was elevated to the rank of supreme commander to face external threats with an unprecedented degree of freedom. He was granted extraordinary powers to eliminate the pirates that infested the Mediterranean, and he did so with surgical precision. Then, he crushed King Mithridates of Pontus, reorganized provinces in Asia, and returned to Rome as a living legend. Pompey embodied the new model of the strong man, a general with the aura of a savior, popular, skillful, respected by his troops, and feared by his peers. At his side, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had gained prestige by crushing the slave revolt led by Spartacus, a rebellion that shook the foundations of the Roman social order. Crassus lacked Pompey's brilliance, but he had something more practical: financial influence, client networks, and political maneuverability. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance based on convenience. But someone else would join the duo. Someone who had observed the institutional collapse from within, who had grown up immersed in the discourse of Roman greatness, and who was willing to go further than all of them. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was a downfallen aristocrat, a young man from a patrician family who had defied Sulla, survived proscription by hiding and fleeing, and returned to Rome with unshakable determination. He understood like no one else the mechanics of power, the passions of the people, and the weaknesses of the Senate. He was a politician with the soul of a general, and a general with the ambition of a reformer. He was cultured, astute, elegant, generous with his allies, and ruthless with his enemies. A consummate actor in the theater of power. Among the three, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, they formed what history would remember as the First Triumvirate, an unofficial pact, sealed in the shadows, in which each contributed a piece. Pompey brought military glory, Crassus brought wealth, Caesar brought cunning. With that agreement, they controlled Roman politics for several years, dividing offices, territories, benefits, and decisions among themselves. Caesar was sent to govern Gaul as a proconsul. What seemed like a routine governorship turned into an epic campaign. In less than a decade, Caesar conquered the entire region, subdued warrior tribes, crossed the Rhine to intimidate the Germanic peoples, and landed in Britannia just to prove he could. His account of the campaigns, recorded in his commentaries on the Gallic War, was both a military chronicle and a piece of personal propaganda. In Rome, each victory increased his prestige. His army had become almost a personal instrument, an extension of his will. Meanwhile, the triumvirate was deteriorating. Crassus died in the disastrous campaign against the Parthians, and Pompey, alarmed by the rise of his former ally, aligned himself with the Senate. The alliance broke. The balance of power shattered once again. And with Crassus's death, confrontation became inevitable. Rome was caught between two giants. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's return as an undefeated hero, demanded that he disband his army before crossing the border into Italy. It was a clear message. If he obeyed, he would be judged, humiliated, and perhaps eliminated. If he disobeyed, he would be declaring civil war. The decision was made in silence, on the banks of a river called the Rubicon. Caesar crossed it with his legions, against the orders of the Senate, and in doing so he uttered a phrase that still echoes through the ages: Alea iacta est, the die is cast. Pompey fled. Rome had no strength to resist. A new civil war began, more brutal and widespread than all the previous ones. Caesar's armies pursued his rival through Greece, Asia, and Egypt. At Pharsalus, in the year 48 before Christ, Pompey was defeated. He fled to Egypt seeking refuge but was betrayed and murdered on the banks of the Nile. When Caesar arrived and saw his severed head presented as a gift, he did not celebrate. He wept, perhaps out of respect, perhaps for political reasons, because he knew that symbols were as powerful as swords. Caesar returned to Rome as the absolute master. He had defeated all his enemies, reformed the calendar, cleared debts, colonized territories, and reorganized the provinces. He declared himself dictator for life, a figure that shattered any pretense of republicanism. His image appeared on coins. His word was law. He had reached the summit, but the price had yet to be paid. The aristocracy would not tolerate it. Some saw him as a usurper, others as a disguised king. And what Rome could not accept, in its historical conscience, was precisely that: the return of a king. That is why, on the Ides of March in the year 44 before Christ, a group of senators organized to restore, as they claimed, freedom to the Republic. They stabbed him in the Senate, at the very heart of power. Among the assassins was Brutus, Caesar's adoptive son. History closed like a tragic circle, with a phrase turned into myth. You too, Brutus? But the assassination did not save the Republic. It destroyed it, because the void left by Caesar could not be filled by the Senate. Rome was no longer the city of institutions. It had become the city of armies, of charisma, of spectacle, and the men who would come after knew that very well. In the next chapter, we will enter that definitive transition, the path to the empire, because when Caesar fell, his shadow remained, and the one who knew how to inherit it was not a famous general, nor a veteran senator. He was a young man, cold and calculating, who would build the new order upon the ruins of the Republic. His name was Octavian, and with him, Rome would begin to call itself by a different name. The brilliance of Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not do so merely as a disobedient general or an ambitious politician. He did it as someone who understood that the Republic no longer functioned, that the game had changed, and that the old forms were, at that moment, an empty mask. It was not about overthrowing the system. The system had already disintegrated from within, after years of corruption, violence, power hoarding, and civil wars. What he did was embrace that reality with the boldness of someone who does not wait for permission. And in that crossing, both symbolic and real, the final stage of the Roman Republic began. The rise of Julius Caesar was not the result of a single act, but of a chain of decisions, gestures, and maneuvers that, together, revealed a political genius capable of always seeing one step ahead of his rivals. Because if anything defined Caesar, it was his ability to adapt to any scenario, accurately reading both the mood of the people and the movements of his adversaries. For years he had cultivated alliances, forgiven enemies, conquered territories, and written his own story. And when he returned to Rome after triumphing in Gaul, he was not merely a victorious general. He was the most popular man in the Roman world. The first thing he did was restore order in a city wounded by fear. His entrance into Rome was calm, without looting or immediate vengeance. Caesar understood that symbols were powerful, and he did not need to crush the Senate to make it clear who was in charge. He presented himself as a restorer, a moderator between warring factions, a peacemaker. But beneath that image of a reconciler operated a logic of total control. He placed his men in key positions, centralized decision-making, and gradually concentrated powers that had previously been distributed among multiple magistracies. The dictatorship he assumed was not like the ones of ancient times, which were limited and temporary. At first, he was named dictator for 1 year, then for 10, and finally dictator for life. Although he never proclaimed himself king, the power he accumulated surpassed any previous figure. His image appeared on coins, his statue stood among those of the gods, and his decisions required nothing more than his signature. But unlike other tyrants, Caesar understood that lasting power cannot rely solely on force. That is why he initiated a series of reforms aimed at legitimizing his rule, at least in the eyes of the more pragmatic. He reorganized the calendar, replacing the confusing lunar system with the Julian calendar, which still forms the basis of our time today. He reduced debts, expanded citizenship, restructured the provinces, increased the number of senators, thus diluting the influence of the traditional patricians, and promoted laws that benefited the lower classes. He was even planning a military campaign in the East to complete the conquest of the Hellenistic world. Caesar did not think in years, he thought in centuries, and his vision, both Roman and personal, blended imperial glory with a deeply human narrative, his own. But Rome, despite everything, was not yet a legally established empire. It remained, at least on the surface, a republic. And that institutional facade was enough for the old defenders of tradition, cornered but still powerful, to decide they had to act. Because even though many senators had benefited from the new order, and even some of his enemies had been forgiven and rehabilitated, deep down, they knew that Caesar's figure represented the end of their world. The conspiracy was planned in silence, without grand speeches or public demonstrations. It included both radicals and moderates, both idealists and opportunists. Some, like Cassius, saw Caesar as a usurper. Others, like Brutus, were torn between personal loyalty and what they believed was their duty to the city. The chosen date was not accidental. The Ides of March, the 15th day, a moment filled with religious symbolism. It was said that on that day, destiny spoke. And on that day, destiny spoke with knives. Caesar was stabbed 23 times during a Senate session. The scene of the crime was not the Forum, but the theater of Pompey, which at that time served as a temporary venue. There was no trial, no speech, no ceremony. There was a body, bleeding out on marble. And there was silence. Because the assassins, far from being celebrated, were met with fear and confusion. The people did not cheer their act. No wave of Republican fervor rose. There was only uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the void was filled by the figure who made the least noise but best understood what was at stake. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and heir. But before reaching him, it is important to understand the impact of that assassination. Caesar's death did not restore the Republic. It destroyed it for good. What followed were acts of revenge, broken alliances, new civil wars, and a fierce struggle for control of what remained. Mark Antony, loyal to Caesar until the end, tried to take up the mantle. His famous speech at the funeral, in which he read Caesar's will and stirred the emotions of the people, was a turning point. The enraged mob set fire to the city. The conspirators fled or were killed. Violence returned, fiercer than ever. For a time, Mark Antony seemed to be the new strongman of Rome, but his ambition and political clumsiness cost him key support. And it was in that chaotic climate that Octavius began to move, with a mixture of cold calculation and daring, that would make him the architect of the new regime. He was barely 18 years old, but already understood that power is not begged for, it is claimed. Caesar's will had named him adoptive son, and he knew how to use that symbolic bond to inherit his political legacy as well. While Mark Antony made strategic mistakes, Octavius built a solid base of loyalty, first among veterans, then among moderate senators. In a short time, a new alliance was forged between Octavius, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, the second triumvirate. This time, unlike the first, it was a legal institution, recognized by the state, and with a single goal: to avenge Caesar and eliminate his assassins. What followed was a bloody purge. The proscriptions returned, lists of people condemned to death, with names written out of convenience and cruelty. Thousands died. Brutus and Cassius were pursued to the east and defeated in the double battle of Philippi. With them died the last republican hope. But the alliance among the triumvirs did not last. Lepidus was pushed aside, and Mark Antony, in his romance with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, drifted away from Rome, both politically and symbolically. His orientalized style, erratic decisions, and closeness to the Egyptian queen made him an easy target for Octavius's propaganda. War between the two was inevitable, and the final battle took place at Actium in the year 31 before Christ. There, in the Ionian Sea, Octavius's forces defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Shortly after, both took their own lives in Alexandria. Octavius returned to Rome as the sole master of the Roman world. But he did not make Caesar's mistake. He did not proclaim himself dictator for life. He did not humiliate the Senate. He did not openly challenge the republican forms. He had himself named Princeps, the first among equals. And with that modest title, he founded something far greater: the empire. Rome had changed forever. The Republic was no longer an institution, it was a memory. And although the Senate still existed, and the old laws were still recited, the Roman world had surrendered to a new logic, one of concentrated, personalized, absolute power. Julius Caesar had lit that fuse, and his assassination did not extinguish the fire. It fanned it. Because when a giant falls, what it leaves behind is not peace. It is an immense void, and that void was about to be filled by a young man who, on the surface, lacked the age and the strength to do so, but who would end up founding a new era. The Unexpected Heir. When Julius Caesar fell beneath the knives of his assassins, Rome was not liberated. It was beheaded. His death, which occurred in the heart of the Senate, in the center of republican power, did not restore the institutions nor bring peace. It left behind a void that no one knew how to fill. He had been the only one capable of temporarily holding together the tensions tearing the city apart. The ambition of the generals, the resentment of the people, the decay of the Senate, and the unrest in the provinces. And with his body still warm on the marble floor, everyone looked at each other with suspicion, waiting to see who would make the next move. It was no minor question, because that void was about to be filled by someone whom no one had taken seriously at first. An 18-year-old youth, beardless, with no military feats, no commanding voice, and no army of his own. But with one detail that would change everything. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. His name was Gaius Octavius Thurinus. Octavius was in Illyria when he learned of the assassination. His reaction was swift, calculated, and entirely devoid of sentiment. He did not seek mourning, nor did he return to Rome out of grief. He did so for strategy. He knew that Caesar's will, made public shortly thereafter, placed him in a unique position, not only as heir to a colossal fortune, but as the political heir to a name sacred to the people. His first move was to officially adopt his adoptive father's name, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and with that gesture, blood no longer mattered. What mattered now was the symbol. The city was burning with emotion. The people adored Caesar as a fallen god. The Senate, still in shock, hesitated between fear and hope that the Republic could be restored. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's colleague and ally, took control of immediate power, but his attitude was provocative, erratic, at times openly hostile toward the Senate. Many expected him to be the natural successor, but his combative style, his alliances with radical veterans, and his ties to the most violent sectors of Roman politics made him a threat to all. Octavius watched from the shadows. Without applying direct pressure, he began building his base. First, he won over Caesar's veterans by promising them land and rewards. Then, he positioned himself as a defender of order, a temporary ally of the Senate, and the guardian of Caesar's legacy. His masterstroke was organizing funeral games in honor of his adoptive father, during which a comet crossed the Roman sky. The people believed they were witnessing the soul of Caesar ascending to the heavens. Octavius did not contradict them. From that moment on, his political campaign would rely on that idea. Caesar was a god, and he, his son. Conflict with Marcus Antonius was inevitable. Both men wanted power. Both saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Caesar's legacy. But direct confrontation was postponed. The common threat of Caesar's assassins, still active in the east under the leadership of Brutus and Cassius, forced a temporary alliance. Thus was born the Second Triumvirate, an official structure, not secret like the first, composed of Octavius, Marcus Antonius, and Lepidus. Its declared goal was to restore stability, but its first act was a political bloodbath. The proscriptions returned. Hundreds of names were written on death lists without trial. Real enemies, old republicans, personal adversaries. One of the most painful names was that of Cicero. Octavius had admired him in his youth, but now he accepted his elimination with cold indifference. Power left no room for sentimental loyalties. Cicero was executed, and his head was displayed in the Forum as a warning. The Republic was not being restored. It was being dismantled. After the battles of Philippi, where the armies of the Triumvirate defeated Brutus and Cassius, the alliance began to fracture. Lepidus was sidelined without much resistance, relegated to a symbolic position. Marcus Antonius, on the other hand, remained a formidable rival. From Egypt, where he had sealed his fate alongside Cleopatra, he developed a parallel court, lavish and oriental, which began to unsettle the conservative sectors of Rome. His scandalous relationship with the Egyptian queen, the rumors of dividing the empire, and the supposed intention to shift the center of power to Alexandria were the perfect fuel for Octavius's propaganda machine. Presenting himself as the defender of Roman identity against the threat of Eastern corruption, Octavius gained the support of both the Senate and the people. He declared war on Cleopatra, not on Marcus Antonius, a clever distinction, and mobilized Rome's forces for a final confrontation. In the year 31 before Christ, at the Battle of Actium, the fleets clashed off the Greek coast. The forces of Octavius, led by his general Agrippa, achieved a crushing victory. Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra fled, defeated to Egypt. The following year, cornered, both took their own lives. History remembers Cleopatra allowing a cobra to bite her on her bed, transformed into myth as reality crumbled around her. With his enemies defeated, Octavius returned to Rome as its undisputed master. But he did not proclaim himself king. He did not repeat Caesar's mistake. Instead of challenging the forms, he appropriated them. In the year 27 before Christ, in a carefully calculated gesture, he returned his powers to the Senate, claiming the Republic had been restored. It was a useful fiction. In gratitude, the Senate granted him a new title, Augustus, the consecrated one, the venerable. From that moment on, the word emperor would begin to acquire the meaning we know today. But at that moment, Rome still pretended that nothing had changed. Augustus ruled with a firm hand and a moderate tone. He called himself Princeps Senatus, the first among the Senate, not its master. He controlled key provinces, centralized the army, created a personal guard, the Praetorian Guard, and consolidated a network of informants. At the same time, he beautified Rome, promoted public morals, financed monumental works, and cultivated an image of piety and austerity. He did not rule like a tyrant. He ruled as if he had always been there, as if he were inevitable. The system he created was a masterpiece of balance. He maintained some republican appearances, allowed certain debates, preserved old magistracies, but everything now revolved around his figure. Laws passed with his approval, military decisions were his alone, and no significant policy was adopted without his consent. The old machinery of the Republic still turned, but he was the one powering it. Citizens could vote, but they knew whom it was wise to applaud. Augustus did not merely govern. He redefined what it meant to be Roman. He promoted a strong cultural identity, a narrative that linked the present with the mythical origins of Rome, and he himself was presented as the fulfillment of that destiny. Poets such as Virgil and Horace lent their pens to this narrative. The Aeneid was not merely a work of art, it was an ideological manifesto. Rome had been born to rule the world, and Augustus was the instrument of the gods. He remained in power for over 40 years. He saw generations of politicians, generals, enemies, and allies come and go. He ruled effectively, with harshness when necessary, with generosity when useful. His reign was long, but not static. He knew how to adapt, how to contain crises, how to reorganize the empire when needed. He died in the year 14 after Christ, surrounded by respect, power, and silence. The Senate deified him. Rome no longer needed kings. It had gods on earth. With him vanished the last remnants of the old republic. Not in books, nor in rituals, nor in the facades of buildings, but in the heart of power. Rome had accepted, almost unknowingly, that it was now an empire. And from that moment on, its destiny would be measured in centuries. But the newborn empire would not rest on promises or names. It would have to be upheld by actions. And that is what comes next. The consolidation of this new Rome, its golden age, the time when the known world bowed to a single law, a single language, a single currency. The era of the Pax Romana. Pax Romana. When Augustus died in the year 14, Anno Domini, Rome did not tremble. There were no conspiracies, no coups, no frantic races to the Senate to fill the power vacuum. The empire he had created continued functioning as if he were still there, as if his shadow had remained clinging to the columns of the Forum, as if the city could no longer breathe without the structure he had left behind. He had achieved what none of his predecessors had even dared to dream, to leave behind a system of power that did not depend solely on his person, but on an entire machine that, though centralized, could keep turning without collapsing. That invisible legacy was, in truth, his greatest work. And with it, Rome entered its golden age. History would remember it with a solemn, almost idealized name, the Pax Romana. But that peace was not the silence of the end. It was the stability of a vast world in full operation. It was an active peace, built with discipline, bureaucracy, guarded roads, and the constant sound of hammers striking stone. It was not the absence of conflict, but total dominion over it. For more than 2 centuries, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Empire experienced an era of unprecedented splendor. Wars didn't disappear entirely, but for the first time in its history, central power maintained control over enormous territories under a single authority, with a single currency, a single administrative language, a single legal system, and a web of roads that stretched from the Syrian desert to the snows of Britannia. The Pax Romana was not only a feat of military power, it was a work of political engineering. Augustus and the emperors who followed him understood that territorial expansion was no longer the goal, but rather the intelligent administration of what had already been conquered. Ruling no longer meant adding new provinces, but connecting what already existed, giving cohesion to a variety of peoples, cultures, and languages that shared neither past nor beliefs, but who gradually began to live under the same set of rules. Roman roads were the central nervous system of this structure. They were not mere dirt paths, but paved arteries, carefully designed, guarded by garrisons, equipped with rest stations, and connected to postal systems that allowed an imperial order to travel from Rome to Gaul or the Danube in just a few days. Along those roads traveled soldiers, merchants, messengers, tax collectors, architects, engineers, and also ideas. Ideas that, without knowing it, would lay the groundwork for many cultural structures that would outlive the empire itself. Cities flourished as never before. Across the empire, forums, theaters, aqueducts, baths, and libraries sprang up. Settlements once founded as military colonies became bustling urban centers, while older cities were transformed in the Roman style. Orthogonal streets, a central square, temples. Living in a Roman city meant access to public baths, running water, free spectacles, and at least the illusion of security. Roman citizenship, though still limited, began to spread slowly, and many local communities adopted Roman legal and urban models as a way to integrate into imperial prestige. Economically, the unification of currency facilitated trade between widely diverse regions. Olive oil from Hispania could reach tables in Egypt. African grain fed the capital. Asian silk circulated through senatorial mansions. Rome became a city that consumed the world, but also an exported model, an unrivaled capital, a political center that breathed thanks to its provinces. And although social inequality persisted, and in many cases worsened, the system offered, at the very least, a sense of order. The empire had rules, it had rhythms, and within that structure, many peoples found something their tribal, monarchical, or feudal systems had never given them: predictability. All this order was sustained by a professional army, disciplined, well-paid, and loyal to the emperor. The Roman legions were both a shield and a message. Wherever they were stationed, they didn't just defend borders, they Romanized. They founded cities, married veterans to local women, introduced customs, and imposed Latin as the language of power. The army was an extension of the state, but also a factory of cultural integration. However, imperial peace was not a pact between equals. It was a peace imposed. When a province rebelled, the response was swift and exemplary. The Jewish revolt in the year 70, which ended with the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem and the looting of the sacred treasure, is one of the most brutal examples. Rome tolerated diverse religions, but not political disobedience. That peace, while real, always carried the implicit threat of force. And even so, most peoples preferred to integrate rather than resist, because resisting Rome often meant centuries of stagnation. During this period, the cult of the emperor became one of the symbolic pillars of the system. It wasn't merely about worshiping a man, it was paying homage to the stability that man represented. In many provinces, temples to the emperors coexisted with traditional cults, and in some cases, emperors were seen as living gods. Power, dressed in religiosity, became naturalized. It became part of the mental landscape of everyday life. Private life, too, was influenced by this climate. In cities, families aspired to a civic ideal. Well-organized marriages, children educated in Roman values, respect for the gods, for order, and for law. Though in practice many of these principles were ignored, the moral discourse was present and served as a kind of cultural glue. Conduct manuals were written, religious festivals were celebrated with massive public participation, and virtues like hard work and saving were promoted as traits of the good citizen. Art and literature flourished under imperial patronage. Poets such as Ovid, Horace, and Virgil not only wrote great works, they defined an imperial aesthetic. The exaltation of Rome, history as a divine mission, civilized life as the highest human achievement. Sculptures depicted eternal emperors, powerful gods, and families united by virtue. The message was always the same. Rome is order. Rome is beauty. Rome is destiny. And yet beneath that surface of marble, gardens, and fountains, something was beginning to crack. The extreme centralization, the dependence on the emperor as the singular figure, the accumulation of power in a few hands, was a risky bet. As long as the emperor was capable, wise, and prudent, everything worked. But what would happen if a weak, cruel, or unstable man came to power? The system had no safety valves. There was peace, yes, but also fragility. The Pax Romana was, in many ways, a carefully maintained illusion, an imposed utopia that worked for a time through a combination of administrative efficiency, surgical brutality, and an unmatched capacity for adaptation. It was the moment when the Mediterranean world seemed contained, understood, unified. A world in which a citizen could travel thousands of kilometers without changing currency or fearing for their life. A world where news arrived over impeccable roads, where law could be invoked in distant provinces, where Roman identity carried weight even outside of Italy. But every order, no matter how stable it may seem, carries within it the seeds of change. And when balance depends on the figure of a single man, succession becomes a trial by fire. Rome was about to face that test, because after Augustus, and after the emperors who managed to uphold his legacy, others would come. Some noble, others infamous. And then peace, so carefully constructed, would begin to show its cracks. The next chapter in the empire's story would no longer speak of expansion or perfect order, but of the men who ruled it, and how the temperament, vices, and passions of those who wore the purple could drag an entire empire toward greatness, or into the abyss. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty. The death of Augustus was not the end of an era, but the beginning of a historical experiment. The transmission of absolute power within a single family, in an empire that still pretended to be a republic. Rome had learned to live under the shadow of one man, but never under the direct inheritance of that power. The so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty was not so much a bloodline as a succession of personalities with completely different styles, obsessions, and weaknesses, which together revealed how complex and sometimes dangerous it could be to govern the world without opposition. 5 emperors, from Tiberius to Nero, traced a map of glory and horror at the very heart of the empire. Tiberius, the immediate successor of Augustus, was perhaps the most prepared, and at the same time the most reluctant. Son of Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, he had been adopted by him as his heir, although reluctantly. Tiberius was a dry, pragmatic man, a military expert, but lacking charisma. He governed efficiently, maintained the administration intact, cared for the army and the treasury, and avoided unnecessary military adventures. But he deeply distrusted the Senate, despised the flattery of the court, and over time withdrew more and more into his own world. In his final years, he retired to the island of Capri, leaving power in the hands of his sinister Praetorian prefect, Sejanus. whose rise was accompanied by a wave of trials, denunciations, and executions. The government became an unbreathable atmosphere, where anyone could be accused of treason. Tiberius died old, weary, and hated, and although he left the empire at peace, his legacy was one of fear. The next on the throne was Caligula, and with him, Rome entered an unexpected nightmare. Son of the popular general Germanicus, Caligula was received with enthusiasm, a young figure who seemed to restore imperial excitement after the somber years of Tiberius. But that enthusiasm did not last long. Just a few months into his rule, something changed in him, perhaps due to illness, or perhaps because absolute power exposes what lies deep within the soul. Caligula became erratic, capricious, and violent. It was said he spoke to the moon, that he slept with his sister Drusilla, that he wished to be worshipped as a living god. He demanded divine honors, emptied the imperial treasury on feasts and absurd projects, executed senators for imagined offenses, and even appointed his own horse, Incitatus, as consul. It was impossible to know whether his actions were mockery, madness, or a challenge to the system. He was assassinated by his own Praetorian guards after only 4 years, as he left a public spectacle. The Senate breathed a sigh of relief. The problem was, there was no plan B. In the midst of the chaos, the Praetorians found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain. He was an older man, with a stammer, a limp, and a reputation as a court jester. But what seemed like weakness turned out to be cunning. Claudius accepted the throne and, against all odds, became a competent emperor. He reformed the administrative apparatus, extended Roman citizenship to new regions, reorganized the provinces, and led an ambitious campaign of conquest, the invasion of Britannia. He founded cities, built aqueducts, improved the justice system. He was a student of history, more comfortable with books than with public speeches, but he knew how to surround himself with experts and maintain the balance between the Senate and the army. Even so, his private life was a disaster. His wife Messalina was involved in sexual scandals and conspiracies until she was executed. His last wife, Agrippina the Younger, had other ambitions, to place her son Nero in power. And thus came to the throne the last of the dynasty, Nero. His figure has been so distorted by history that it is difficult to separate myth from truth. It has been said that he set fire to Rome for inspiration, that he played the lyre while the city burned, that he disguised himself to assault citizens at night, that he murdered his mother and his wife, and that he saw himself more as an artist than a ruler. Some of these accounts are true. Others are later exaggerations. What is indisputable is that Nero began his reign with promises of renewal and justice, guided by philosophers such as Seneca, but he soon fell into a spiral of paranoia and delusion. He eliminated his enemies, persecuted the Christians after the Great Fire of the year 64, spent fortunes on personal performances, and began to see himself as a unique, superior, almost sacred figure. His urban reforms after the fire, including his lavish golden palace, outraged the population and drained the state's finances. Eventually, Rome's patience ran out. Governors, generals, and senators began to conspire. In the year 68, Galba, governor of Hispania, rebelled. The Praetorian Guard abandoned Nero, the Senate declared him a public enemy, and the emperor fled the city, taking refuge in a country villa, where he ended up committing suicide, assisted by a slave. His last words, according to historians, were, "What a great artist dies with me." With his death, the Julio-Claudian Dynasty came to an end. In barely half a century, Rome had gone from the serene majesty of Augustus to the moral and political collapse of Nero. It was a lesson about unrestrained power, about the fragility of the imperial system when it falls into the hands of unstable men, and about how the appearance of stability can conceal growing tensions. The Julio-Claudian dynasty showed that the empire was much more than a territory. It was a stage where each emperor stamped his character on the entire world. And now, with the throne empty and no clear heirs, Rome would plunge into one of the most turbulent years in its history. The year in which not one, not two, but 4 different men contested the purple. A year without an owner, without order, without direction. That will be the next story. The year of the 4 emperors. The death of Nero did not bring relief. It brought a void, a deep, dangerous void, with no clear name or solid structure to fill it. For more than a century, Rome had operated under an illusion. The idea that imperial succession could be maintained within a dynasty, that power could be inherited like a family property, that stability depended on the continuity of a bloodline. But when the last Julio-Claudian fell, there was no son, no cousin, not even a nephew with the political weight to claim the throne. The empire, vast and accustomed to a central figure, suddenly became orphaned. And that orphanhood quickly turned into a war of ambitions. The year 69 after Christ would forever be remembered as the year of the 4 emperors. A calendar marked not by harvests, campaigns, or celebrations, but by coups, military marches, betrayals, and suicides. In just 12 months, Rome had 4 princes, 4 faces that wore the imperial purple, 4 men who proclaimed themselves lords of the world. None were chosen by the people, none by the Senate. All came to power by force, and almost all died for the same reason. The first was Galba. Old, rigid, deeply conservative, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. When Rome was still burning with rumors after Nero's suicide, Galba rose up in arms with the support of several Western legions. His legitimacy did not come from bloodline, but from the collective rejection of the previous regime. He was essentially an emperor by necessity. But once on the throne, Galba proved incapable of managing the tensions of a broken capital. He refused to pay the rewards promised to the troops that had supported him, imposed harsh punishments, and replaced officials without a clear policy. The hopes of a Republican restoration that some senators had entertained vanished quickly. Galba was not the savior they had expected, just a weak body at the center of a hurricane. His most serious mistake, however, was political. He chose as successor a young nobleman named Lucius Calpurnius Piso, completely ignoring Otho, one of his first allies, who had been waiting to be adopted and named heir. Otho, cunning and ambitious, did not forgive the betrayal. In just a few days, he bribed the Praetorian Guard, which had not forgotten Galba's broken promises. One January morning, Galba and Piso were murdered in the Forum, their heads cut off and displayed to the people as trophies. Thus, Otho became emperor. Otho, although scorned by some as an effeminate hedonist, he had been the husband of Poppaea, the woman Nero later took for himself, proved to be a skilled and pragmatic ruler. He tried to stabilize the situation, offered amnesties, and reached out to the Senate. But he did not count on another governor, Vitellius, commander of the legions along the Rhine, who had already been proclaimed emperor by his troops even before Galba's death. By the time Otho took power, Vitellius was already marching toward Italy with a seasoned and determined army. Civil war was inevitable. Otho could have resisted. His army was loyal, and he still had the support of the Praetorian Guard. But the decisive battle, fought at Bedriacum in northern Italy, was a defeat. Although both sides suffered heavy losses, Vitellius's forces managed to break through. Upon hearing the result, Otho made a surprising decision. He took his own life. He did not want to plunge Rome into further bloodshed. He left a note to his friends and plunged a dagger into his chest. He was only 36 years old. News of Otho's noble gesture shocked Rome, but it was too late. Vitellius entered the city as emperor, and his reign was a mix of incompetence and excess. He was an unrepentant glutton, lover of banquets and vulgar pleasures, with no real experience in government. He delegated administration to unqualified favorites, and his conduct quickly alienated both the Senate and the provinces. But what sealed his fate was the contempt he showed toward the army of the East. In Judea, Syria, and Egypt, the legions were still active in local conflicts, and their commander, Gaius Julius Vespasian, had earned enormous prestige after years of tough and effective campaigns. Unlike the improvised emperors who had ruled since Nero's death, Vespasian had the ideal profile. Veteran, disciplined, pragmatic, with a support network in the East and the tacit backing of Egypt, a key supplier of grain. The legions of those regions, tired of the chaos in Rome, proclaimed him emperor. And thus began the final civil war of that terrible year. While Vespasian organized his rise from Alexandria, his general Antonius Primus led the operations in Italy. Once again, the battle was decided at Bedriacum, the second of the year, and this time, Vitellius was completely defeated. He took refuge in Rome, barricaded himself in the imperial palace, and tried to negotiate. But no one wanted to support his rule anymore. The Flavian troops entered the city, and in a brutal scene, Vitellius was dragged through the streets, killed and thrown into the Tiber. His reign had lasted only 8 months. And so, in December of that same year, Vespasian was welcomed as the new emperor. But his victory was not only military, it was symbolic. It put an end to the chaos and gave the empire a clear direction once again. With him began a new dynasty, the Flavians. His government marked a turning point, the transition from a power inherited through bloodline, as in the Julio-Claudian era, to an empire governed by military and administrative competence. Rome had learned that the throne could change hands, that imperial authority was not divine, and that chaos was always lurking when power weakened. The year of the 4 emperors revealed in harsh terms how fragile the Roman order could be when institutions were not enough and everything depended on force. But it also revealed something deeper, the resilience of the system. Because despite the wars, the assassinations, and the betrayals, the empire did not collapse. It adapted. It reconfigured itself. Over the corpses of Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, Rome found Vespasian, and with him, a new opportunity. The next chapter of this story will be no less intense. Because Vespasian did not rule alone, he left behind a legacy, a family, and a monumental symbol that to this day defines the image of the empire. The next step will be to explore that new stage, the era of the Flavians and the construction of the Colosseum. The Flavians and the Colosseum. When Vespasian took power in the final stretch of the year 69, Rome didn't need promises. It needed results. The chaos of the previous 12 months had left scars everywhere. A weakened economy, restless provinces, fractured loyalties, the Senate's prestige in ruins, and above all, the sense that the empire was a body without a skeleton. The rise of the Flavians, a family of modest origin compared to the patrician lineages that had dominated Roman politics for centuries, was a wake-up call. The throne was no longer the property of a dynasty or a hereditary right. It was a conquest. Power now belonged to those who knew how to seize it, manage it, and keep it. Vespasian, a seasoned military commander hardened by campaigns in Germania, Britannia, and Judea, understood the imperial machine the way a general understands a legion, with order, discipline, and clear objectives. He was not a man of spectacle or excess, but a methodical builder. The first thing he did was stabilize the empire's finances, which were on the verge of collapse. He reformed the tax system, created new levies, including the infamous tax on public latrines, which inspired his famous phrase, "Money doesn't stink," and reorganized revenue collection with an almost obsessive rigor. Under his leadership, the Roman state began to breathe again, but his gaze extended beyond the present. He knew that every regime needs symbols to represent it, works that tell a story. And in that sense, Vespasian left a legacy that would survive for centuries. He began construction of the Flavian amphitheater, better known today as the Colosseum. He built it on the site of Nero's vanished Golden House, that gigantic palace the tyrant had erected for himself after the Great Fire of Rome. Where once there had been a private artificial lake, Vespasian raised a public monument, a calculated and powerful gesture. He was giving back to the city what despotism had stolen. The people did not forget that message. The emperor was moving away from personal cult and toward the image of a servant of the people. The Colosseum was not just stone and architecture. It was propaganda carved in marble. There, games were held, gladiator combats, naval spectacles, battle reenactments. It was a theater of power, where the emperor appeared as a generous host and protector of order. For generations, it would become the center of Roman public life. But for Vespasian, the Colosseum was not an end in itself. It was part of a larger project to rebuild the empire's credibility after the moral collapse of the previous regime. Vespasian died in the year 79, after a decade of stable and effective rule. His death was not shrouded in grand ceremonies or mythological accounts, but in a phrase he spoke with irony on his deathbed. "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." It was a mocking reference to the habit of deifying dead emperors. That lucidity, that final wit, closed a cycle of sobriety that many Romans came to respect. His son Titus, the direct heir, took the throne without conflict. He was young, handsome, brave, and very popular among the army and the people. But his reign, though brief, was marked by a tragedy forever etched in history: the eruption of Vesuvius. In the year 79, just months after ascending to power, the volcano buried the cities of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabiae under tons of ash and lava. It was a colossal natural disaster that forced the emperor to prove his capacity for response and compassion. Titus organized aid, allocated funds from the public treasury for the victims, and oversaw the reconstruction of parts of the affected regions. Rome, accustomed to the apathy of some earlier emperors, felt that this new leader genuinely cared about its citizens. Titus also inaugurated the Colosseum with 100 days of uninterrupted games, the likes of which had never been seen. Gladiators, wild beasts, public executions, theatrical plays, and banquets accompanied the opening of the world's greatest amphitheater. It was his way of consecrating his father's legacy and asserting his own authority before the crowd. And yet, despite his popularity, his rule was short-lived. He died suddenly in the year 81, under circumstances that were never fully clarified. Some rumors spoke of poisoning, others of a sudden illness. What is certain is that his younger brother, Domitian, was the one who inherited the throne. Domitian marked a change in tone. Unlike his father and brother, he ruled with a more autocratic, more distant, more authoritarian style. He was obsessive about military discipline, ruthless against administrative corruption, and rigorous in his justice, but also distrustful, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. He strengthened the imperial cult, demanded to be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and began to surround himself with informants and spies. Secret executions, trials for treason, and palace purges multiplied. The Senate, humiliated and silenced, hated him in silence. The people, on the other hand, respected him for his efficiency and his policies on price controls, grain distribution, and border defense. During his reign, important public works were built, such as the stadium that bears his name, later transformed into the Piazza Navona, and the Arch of Titus, which commemorated his brother's victory in Judea and the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. But neither the buildings nor the military triumphs could erase the growing political tension in the capital. In the end, his inner circle conspired against him. In the year 96, Domitian was assassinated in his chambers by palace officials with the support of his wife. The Senate, in an act of revenge, ordered a damnatio memoriae. His name was erased from inscriptions, his statues destroyed, his memory officially condemned. Thus ended the Flavian dynasty, a family that, in just 27 years, had managed to rescue the empire from chaos, leave behind enduring material legacies, and demonstrate that power did not require aristocratic lineage, only governing skill. The Colosseum still stood. Taxes were being collected on time, the borders were secure. But the question was no longer whether Rome would survive. It was whether it would find leaders capable of upholding the structure without fracturing it from within. In the next chapter of this story, we'll meet an extraordinary sequence of emperors who, against all odds, would manage to maintain that balance. Men chosen not by blood, but by merit, who would lead Rome to the peak of its splendor. A new era was approaching, the time of the 5 good emperors. The 5 good emperors. After the upheavals of the previous century, after the Julio-Claudian intrigues, the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors, and the strict order of the Flavian dynasty, Rome seemed to have finally found an almost miraculous formula: to choose the emperor not by his surname, nor by his lineage, nor by the blood running through his veins, but by his ability to govern. It was not a formal decision, nor an official decree, but for nearly a century, the imperial throne was passed down by adoption, not by biological inheritance. And in that change, perhaps accidental, lay one of the keys to the greatest splendor Rome would ever know. This stage began with Nerva, an elderly senator chosen after the assassination of Domitian. He was a moderate man, experienced, without personal ambition. He assumed power as an institutional compromise, a kind of bridge between what had been and what ought to be. But Nerva was not strong militarily, and he soon realized that true power no longer resided in the Senate, but in the legions. To ensure peace, he made a crucial decision. He adopted as his son and successor the most respected commander of the Roman army, Marcus Ulpius Trajan. With that gesture, Nerva guaranteed the regime's stability and laid the groundwork for a new dynasty based on merit. Trajan ascended the throne in the year 98, and under his rule, Rome experienced an unprecedented expansion. He was a different kind of emperor. Born in Hispania, a brilliant military leader, austere in his lifestyle, close to the people, and with a clear vision of what the empire should be. Under his command, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, present-day Romania, after hard-fought campaigns that cost thousands of lives, but ended in a crushing victory. That conquest was celebrated in the capital with one of the most iconic monuments of the ancient world, Trajan's Column, a narrative carved in marble that spirals upward, as if history itself were ascending toward the gods. Trajan did not stop there. He launched campaigns in the east, took Armenia and Mesopotamia, and advanced to the Persian Gulf. It was the last great Roman offensive toward the east. But Trajan was also a reformer. He improved provincial administration, promoted public works throughout the empire, created funds for the assistance of orphans and the poor, the alimenta, and strengthened the network of roads, aqueducts, and ports. He governed through practicality, not ostentation. When he died in the year 117, after nearly 20 years in power, he was deified and remembered as the ideal emperor. In fact, for centuries, new emperors would be greeted by the Senate with the ritual phrase, "May you be more fortunate than Augustus and better than Trajan." But the story did not end there. His successor, Hadrian, had also been adopted, this time by testament, and represented a very different mindset. Where Trajan saw expansion, Hadrian saw consolidation. Where one advanced, the other withdrew. Hadrian canceled the eastern campaigns, redefined the frontiers, and built defensive fortifications, among them the famous wall that bears his name in Britannia. His vision of the empire was more philosophical, more rational. He traveled tirelessly through all the provinces, from Egypt to Hispania, from Africa to Germania, seeking to understand every corner, every population, every custom. He was a present emperor, but also a reserved one, erudite, In love with Greek culture, obsessed with architecture, art, and law, Hadrian also suffered personal tragedies. His young lover, Antinous, died under mysterious circumstances during a journey along the Nile, and the emperor turned him into a divine figure, founding a city in his name and promoting his cult throughout the empire. In his later years, tormented by illness and loneliness, Hadrian withdrew to his villa in Tivoli, a kind of parallel world where he recreated temples, landscapes, and gardens from every place he had visited. He died in the year 138, after naming as heir Antoninus Pius, a senator of stable character, moderate and deeply respected. With Antoninus began the most peaceful phase of the empire. His reign, which lasted 23 years, was a time of sustained peace, legal reforms, justice, and fiscal balance. There were no major wars, no internal revolts, no economic crises. It was in many ways the apotheosis of the Roman model, an administration that functioned, a strong currency, secure borders, and a population increasingly Romanized. Antoninus maintained stability to such an extent that his name became synonymous with serenity. But his greatest legacy was having adopted as successor an exceptional young man, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is perhaps the most enigmatic emperor in the history of Rome. A Stoic philosopher, author of the celebrated Meditations, an intimate journal of thoughts on duty, death, suffering, and virtue. He assumed power bearing a burden that no book could ease, the responsibility of sustaining an empire in times of trial. His reign was marked by constant wars in the north, against Germanic peoples who pressured the Danube frontier. There were also devastating plagues, economic crises, and religious unrest. But Marcus Aurelius ruled with integrity, with discipline, and with an unshakable faith in duty. He was an emperor who suffered in silence, who wrote at night about the fleeting nature of life, and the next day marched to the front lines with his troops. He died in the field in the year 180, after nearly 2 decades of a harsh but honorable reign. And it was then that, for the first time in a long while, the virtuous cycle of adoption based on merit was broken. Marcus Aurelius handed the throne to his biological son, Commodus. And that decision, as human as it was dangerous, would change everything. Because if the 5 good emperors had shown that Rome could be governed with wisdom, justice, and balance, what came next would reveal the opposite. The empire would enter a new stage, darker, more violent, more uncertain. An era in which the throne would once again become a prize, a trap, a sentence. But that, of course, will be the story of the next chapter. Commodus and the beginning of the end. When Marcus Aurelius drew his last breath in a military tent near the Danube, surrounded by legions, maps, and philosophical treatises, many in Rome expected his death to mark the end of a glorious era. But not in the way it happened. The succession of his son Commodus, still young, raised more in the luxuries of the palace than in the fields of battle, marked a sharp turn in the course of the empire. For the first time in nearly a century, power returned to the hands of a biological son, not an heir adopted on merit, and that simple difference became a crack through which decadence would begin to seep. Commodus was only 19 years old when he became emperor. His image clashed violently with that of his father. Where Marcus Aurelius was austere, methodical, and reflective, Commodus was impulsive, extravagant, and vain. Although at first he maintained a certain continuity in imperial policies and enjoyed a period of relative peace, he soon began to reveal an unstable personality dangerously centered on his own ego. He did not want to govern the empire. He wanted to enjoy it. He was not interested in matters of state, but in the applause of the circus. His obsession was not with law or diplomacy, but with public spectacles, gladiatorial combat, and his own image as a deified hero. And Commodus was not content with being emperor. He wanted to be seen as a new Hercules, dressed in a lion's skin, wielding a club, and fighting personally in the arena of the Colosseum. He participated in staged combats, killed wild animals before the public, and demanded to be worshipped as a living incarnation of the Greek demigod. Rome, which for centuries had revered dignitas, gravitas, and auctoritas as essential virtues, now found itself ruled by a jester with a crown, a young man who confused power with spectacle. As his narcissism grew, so did his paranoia. Commodus began to isolate himself, to surround himself with flatterers, to distrust senators and generals. Executions multiplied. Trials for treason became tools of political control, and the empire began to sink into an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. He delegated administration to favorites, many of them corrupt and incompetent, and distanced himself completely from the actual functioning of the state. His lack of interest in the frontiers allowed instability to emerge in Britannia, in Germania, and in Africa. Although he did not lose territories, Rome began to show signs of fatigue. His relationship with the Senate was especially destructive. Commodus openly despised the traditional aristocracy, mocking its rituals, minimizing its authority, and favoring individuals of obscure origin. He went so far as to rename Rome as Commodian Colony, renamed the months of the calendar in his honor, and demanded that the statues of the gods be replaced with images of himself. The imperial cult, which had previously been a carefully managed political tool, became a grotesque farce. The Senate hated him, the people began to doubt him, and the army, though still loyal, watched with growing unease. In the final years of his rule, Commodus lived almost in a parallel world. He slept in the palace surrounded by gladiators, organized orgies disguised as religious banquets, executed those closest to him if they made him feel inferior, and walked through the halls of the Domus Aurea as if it were Olympus. Conspiracies began to emerge from all sides. Some were brutally crushed, others were ignored, but one at last succeeded. On the 31st of December in the year 192, Commodus's favorite concubine, Marcia, discovered that her name appeared on a list of people marked for elimination. Fearing for her life, she acted first. She poisoned the emperor during dinner. Commodus, though weakened, did not die immediately, so a professional athlete was sent to strangle him in his bath. And so ended the life of the gladiator emperor, the new Hercules, the god-man of Rome, murdered in his own home, like so many others before and after. But his death did not bring relief. It brought more chaos. With Commodus gone and no clear successor, the empire once again entered a phase of violent transition. The Senate attempted to restore balance by appointing Pertinax, an elderly senator of great prestige. His rule lasted barely 3 months. He tried to impose discipline, curb waste, and restore order, but he failed to understand that the atmosphere had changed. The Praetorian Guard, spoiled by the privileges of Commodus's era, rebelled and murdered him. What happened next was even more scandalous. The Praetorians put the throne up for auction, literally. They auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder. The winner was Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator who offered the largest sum of money. His rule was a mockery. The people despised him, the Senate tolerated him with disgust, and the provincial armies immediately rose in revolt. In 3 different regions, the generals Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and Septimius Severus were proclaimed emperors by their troops. A new civil war had begun. Of the 3, only one truly understood what was at stake: Septimius Severus. He quickly marched toward Rome, deposed Julianus, who was executed after 66 days in power, and took the throne. But he did not stop there. In the following years, he defeated his rivals, consolidated his authority, and founded a new dynasty, the Severan dynasty. The era of Commodus was not merely a period of personal decadence. It was a warning sign. It marked the end of the High Empire, of the institutional stability that the 5 good emperors had managed to build. From his reign onward, Rome would never again enjoy an orderly succession, nor an imperial power legitimized by merit. A darker, more unstable age was beginning, one where the sword would outweigh the toga, and where decisions would no longer be made in the Senate, but in military barracks. And as the empire began to tremble, a new form of rule was emerging, more militarized, more authoritarian, more vertical. A silent transformation that would forever change the nature of Rome. The story of that transformation will be the focus of our next chapter, the rise of the Severans and the path toward the crisis of the 3rd century. The Severans and the militarization of the empire. With the rise of Septimius Severus, Rome entered a new stage, marked by a subtle but irreversible shift. The empire's center of gravity began to move, ceasing to be political and civilian, and becoming increasingly military and autocratic. Though the Senate still existed and republican institutions retained their form, their power was now purely symbolic. What ruled were the legions. What upheld the emperor was not consensus, but the obedience of the armies. And what would define the fate of Rome in the years to come would be, more than ever, the force of arms. Septimius Severus was not a traditional aristocrat. Born in Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya, his African origin, his blend of Punic and Italic blood, and his purely military career made him a very different kind of emperor. He did not speak with elegance, had no interest in philosophical subtleties or in the rhetorical games of the Senate. He was a man of action. From the very beginning, he made it clear that his government would rest on the army. He raised soldiers' salaries, allowed them to marry legally, something previously forbidden during service, and filled the administration with trusted men, many of them from the military world. The message was clear. Loyalty to the emperor was all that mattered, and that loyalty was bought, rewarded, and closely watched. The army, which until then had been the arm of power, became the core of power. The uniform became more influential than the toga. Generals were more decisive than senators. This was the beginning of a transformation that would forever change the nature of the empire. Severus not only consolidated his authority in Rome, he also undertook major campaigns to reaffirm control over the provinces. In the east, he fought the Parthians with legendary ferocity. In North Africa, he reinforced the frontier. In Britannia, he marched with his family to organize an offensive against the Caledonian tribes. Though gravely ill, he continued to oversee the campaign until his death in the year 211 in the city of Iberacum, modern-day York. His parting words were as pragmatic as his life. Keep the soldiers united, and nothing else will matter. The succession then passed to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, but their fraternal coexistence was short-lived. Caracalla, ambitious and violent, ordered Geta's murder just months after their father's death. He did so in front of their mother, in the very halls of the imperial palace, staining with blood the corridors that had recently echoed with speeches of unity. Geta was erased not only physically but symbolically. His images were destroyed, his name proscribed, his memory condemned to oblivion. Rome was once again witnessing the raw reality of a dynasty sustained by force and fear. Caracalla, now sole emperor, made decisions that would shape the empire's direction. The most famous of these was the Constitutio Antoniniana, a law passed in 212 that granted Roman citizenship to all free men across the empire. On the surface, it seemed an act of generosity, an unprecedented expansion of rights. But the underlying motive was more practical. By increasing the number of citizens, the tax base grew, and army recruitment became easier. Rome was no longer a city surrounded by provinces. It had become a vast, uniform, militarized, and centralized fabric. Caracalla also shared his father's obsession with the army. He spent massive sums on the soldiers, increased their privileges, and built new military facilities. His popularity among the troops was solid, but his relationship with the civilian elite was disastrous. Senators feared him, administrators despised him, and the people saw him as unpredictable. He commissioned the monumental Baths of Caracalla, one of the most colossal works of imperial Rome. But behind this public gesture lurked an increasingly authoritarian regime, more violent, more unstable. His end was brutal and predictable. While traveling east to launch a new campaign against the Parthians, he was assassinated by a centurion in an ambush orchestrated by his own praetorian prefect, Macrinus. With his death, the Severan dynasty entered a turbulent phase. Macrinus, the first emperor to take power without being a senator, without aristocratic roots, and without belonging to a noble family, was seen as a usurper. His reign was brief. In 218, he was overthrown by legions loyal to a new contender, Elagabalus. Elagabalus, a mere teenager of 14, descendant of the Severans through his mother, was brought to power by his grandmother Julia Maesa, a woman with political skill as sharp as her ambition. But the new emperor was far from what Rome expected. Raised as a priest of the god El-Gabal in Syria, he introduced foreign religious practices into the heart of the empire, proclaimed himself high priest of an Eastern solar cult, mixed pagan rituals with personal scandals, and, according to ancient sources, often hostile and exaggerated, engaged in behavior that shocked even a city accustomed to excess. His reign was brief, extravagant, and tragic. He was murdered by his own guards and his body thrown into the Tiber. After him came Alexander Severus, his younger cousin but far more balanced. His mother, Julia Mamea, took effective control of the government for much of his reign, trying to restore a sense of rationality and order. Alexander was a well-intentioned emperor, interested in philosophy, justice, and reconciliation with the Senate. But the situation had changed. The provinces were restless, the frontiers more porous, the enemies more daring. In Germania, he had to lead military campaigns personally, and his policy of negotiating with Germanic tribes was seen by the army as a sign of weakness. In 235, Alexander was assassinated by his own troops, fed up with his indecision. His death marked the end of the Severan dynasty, and more importantly, the end of any pretense of imperial stability. From then on, Rome would enter a prolonged period of chaos. Short-lived emperors, constant coups, civil wars, barbarian invasions, economic crises, plagues, inflation. Everything that had been built over centuries began to shake. The Severans had tried to rule through the army, and for a time, they succeeded. But their strategy, though effective in the short term, left the empire without internal balance. Rome had shed its skin. It was no longer a disguised republic, nor a refined empire. It had become a militarized state in constant tension. Power was more fragile than ever, and the shadow of collapse was drawing near. The next chapter will take us straight into that abyss, the crisis of the 3rd century, a time of fleeting emperors, endless wars, and an empire that seemed on the verge of disappearing. The great crisis of the 3rd century. Rome had endured much. Civil wars, mad emperors, foreign invasions, plagues, fires, earthquakes, internal rebellions, and yet it had survived everything. But nothing had brought it so close to collapse as what began to unfold after the death of Alexander Severus. What followed was a dizzying era, a chain of disasters, a long decade that lasted not 10 years, but more than 50. A time in which the word empire seemed more like a memory than a reality. A period in which Rome almost disappeared. Official history calls it the crisis of the 3rd century, but that name, so academic and sanitized, barely hints at the magnitude of what occurred. From the year 235 to 284, the Roman world was caught in a spiral of unprecedented chaos. In just half a century, more than 20 emperors followed one another, most of them proclaimed by the troops on different fronts and assassinated shortly afterward. They were not statesmen, but generals in the field, improvised, desperate, forced to govern amid battles, betrayals, and forced marches. Power ceased to have a fixed face. The emperor was no longer an almost divine figure surrounded by rites and monuments, but a soldier covered in dust, sword in hand, trying to hold on to a territory that slipped through his fingers like sand. The soldiers became the ultimate judges. He who kept them happy lived. He who failed died. Legitimacy was no longer granted by the Senate, nor the people, nor the gods. It was granted by the military camps. And while inside the empire the generals fought for the purple with blood, from outside the threats multiplied. In the north, Germanic peoples crossed the Rhine and the Danube with alarming frequency. They were raiders, yes, but also armies. Tribe after tribe, federation after federation, crossed the undefended borders and advanced into the heart of the empire, destroying cities, taking slaves, burning temples, seizing lands and wealth. Often they were not defeated. They simply withdrew after obtaining what they wanted. In the east, the enemy was even more sophisticated. The Sasanian Empire, heir to the ancient Parthians, had reorganized with tremendous strength. Under the command of Shapur, the Persians not only resisted Roman attacks but took the war into the heart of the eastern provinces. In a culminating moment, the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured in battle, publicly humiliated, and used by the Persians as a living trophy, forced to serve as a human step for Shapur to mount his horse. He died in captivity, and his skin was stuffed as a warning. Rome had never suffered such humiliation. To this were added plague, inflation, ruined harvests, the collapse of roads, and the abandonment of cities. The empire's population decreased. Trade slowed to a near halt. Coins catastrophically lost value. Maritime routes became dangerous. In many regions, people simply stopped paying taxes, fled to the countryside, or hid in fortified villas. Rome became unrecognizable. In the most remote provinces, the connection with central authority was no longer visible. Those who could maintain local order ruled. Autonomous kingdoms emerged, usurpers who created mini-empires with their own coins, armies, and bureaucracies. One of the most well-known examples was the Palmyrene Empire. In what is now Syria, a powerful queen, Zenobia, took advantage of the power vacuum and founded her own political entity. Not only did she govern effectively, but she declared herself sovereign of a large part of the East, extending her control from Egypt to Anatolia. She maintained a splendid court, a well-disciplined army, and a solid administration. For a time, Palmyra rivaled Rome in splendor and efficiency. Meanwhile, in the west, another mini-state emerged, the Gallic Empire, a separatist entity that grouped several northern provinces and maintained its own emperor, its own magistrates, and a completely autonomous structure. The Roman Empire, divided into 3 large blocks, already seemed like a relic of itself. The statues of the old emperors still stood, the imperial eagles still waved, but cohesion had been lost. It was not a sudden fall, but a prolonged, silent, and devastating decomposition. Each part of the imperial body began to move on its own, and without a clear head, the entire organism was staggering. In the midst of this disaster, figures emerged who tried to stop the bleeding. Some succeeded partially, though they paid the price with their lives. Aurelian was one of the most notable. Proclaimed emperor by the troops in the year 270, he launched a series of lightning campaigns to reunify the empire. He defeated the Gallic Empire, subdued Zenobia and Palmyra, reorganized the defenses, and even began building a new wall around Rome, fearing a direct invasion. His energy and discipline made him a feared and respected leader, but he was assassinated in a palace conspiracy before completing 5 years in power. The causes of the crisis were multiple. It was not only about invasions or internal wars or plague, it was the combination of everything. A system that had worked for centuries was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. The vastness of the territory, the lack of clear succession, the dependence on the army, the administrative overload, the tax pressure, the economic stagnation, the loss of trust in institutions. the absence of a shared identity, all contributed to the collapse. And yet, Rome did not fall. Against all odds, it endured. Like a wounded body refusing to die, the empire found within itself the strength to reform. That reform, which would be radical, authoritarian, and profoundly transformative, would come from a new emperor who, like Aurelian, would emerge from the army. His name was Diocletian. With him, Rome would cease to be what it had been, but in return it would survive a while longer. Next, we will explore that transformation, the Tetrarchy, the reorganization of power, and the emergence of a new form of empire. An empire in which the emperor would no longer be a citizen among citizens, but an almost sacred, distant, absolute figure. A complete reconfiguration of the system to prevent its collapse. Because when a body can no longer be healed, it must reinvent itself. And that is exactly what was about to happen. Diocletian and the Tetrarchy. When Rome seemed on the verge of breaking apart, when emperors were dying almost as fast as they were proclaimed, and when the provinces no longer knew whom to obey, a name emerged that would mark the beginning of a new era. Diocletian, born in the humble province of Dalmatia, with no notable family name or senatorial ties, came from the very place power originated in those days, the army. But unlike so many soldier emperors before him, he did not merely seek survival. He wanted to redesign the empire from its foundations. At the beginning of the year 284, Diocletian was proclaimed emperor by his troops following the death of Numerian. And from that moment on, he understood that ruling Rome was no longer a matter of charisma, inheritance, or even military glory. It had become a matter of administration, of structure, of control. The empire was too vast, too complex, too fragmented to be managed by one man alone. That is why Diocletian did not try to govern it like his predecessors. He divided it, not as a sign of rupture, but as a strategy for survival. What he proposed was revolutionary: to create a shared system of power, a network of multiple rulers that could respond to local crises immediately, without depending on the slow machinery of the central authority. Thus, the Tetrarchy was born. In Greek, it means rule of four. In practice, it meant the creation of two senior emperors, called Augusti, and two juniors, known as Caesares. Each of them would hold authority over a specific region of the empire, with their own court, their own army, and their own administration. Diocletian reserved the eastern part for himself, establishing his headquarters in Nicomedia, in Asia Minor. For the western half, he appointed Maximian, his loyal companion in arms, who governed from Mediolanum, present-day Milan. Then they each named their Caesars, Galerius for the east, and Constantius Chlorus for the west. In this way, the empire now had four heads, four decision-making centers, four coordinated zones of action. It was, in theory, a machine perfectly calibrated to face threats on all fronts. But the reform was not only political. Diocletian understood that the collapse of the previous century was not due solely to wars, but also to the exhaustion of the economic and fiscal system. The state was impoverished. The coinage was little more than worthless copper pieces. Tax collection was inefficient, and although the army was large, it was difficult to sustain. That is why he launched a monetary reform, attempted to stabilize prices with the famous Edict on Maximum Prices, an effort to curb inflation by limiting the cost of goods and services, and reorganized tax collection by establishing more uniform and effective criteria. On the social front, he also imposed harsh measures. He increased state control over professions, made trades hereditary, bound peasants to the land, foreshadowing what centuries later would be known as feudal serfdom, and reinforced the hierarchical structure of the empire. For many, this was an unmasked dictatorship. But for Diocletian, it was the only way to prevent Rome from dissolving entirely. And on the symbolic level, he took an even bolder step. He radically transformed the image of the emperor. If Augustus had been first among equals, and the emperors of the High Empire still walked among the people, Diocletian turned the throne into something distant, almost sacred. He adopted Eastern court rituals, demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and surrounded the imperial figure with an almost mystical protocol. The emperor was no longer a politician, nor even a general. He was the embodiment of order, inaccessible, absolute. This change in image was not superficial. It was deliberate. In an empire where local loyalties threatened to fragment unity, where any governor could dream of declaring himself emperor, Diocletian needed to create an authority beyond question. And for that, he needed the emperor to be more than just a man. He had to be a celestial figure. This ensured obedience, not through fear of punishment, but through reverence for the aura of power. The consequences were profound. The empire's center of gravity shifted eastward, where administration was more efficient and cities were more secure. Nicomedia became a new hub of power, and later so would Constantinople. The symbolic weight of Rome began to fade. It was no longer the empire's effective capital, even though its name still held the political idea together. The message was clear. The empire was no longer a city. It was a structure, a system, an idea in motion. For a few years, the Tetrarchy worked. The frontiers stabilized. Invasions were contained. The fiscal system began to recover some effectiveness, and imperial authority regained respect. But the balance was fragile. Because although Diocletian's design was meticulous, it had one flaw. It did not solve the problem of succession. What would happen when one of the Augusti died or stepped down? Would the Caesars accept the automatic promotion of their counterpart? Would the legions respect a hierarchy designed in an office? Diocletian tried to set the example. In the year 305, he voluntarily stepped down from power, something unthinkable at the time. He did so from his palace on the Dalmatian coast, in what is now split, allowing the Caesars to rise as the new Augusti. It was his way of saying, the system stands above the individual. But the others did not share his vision. Soon, rival ambitions, jealousy, and intrigue began to unfold, and the tetrarchic system, so carefully constructed, began to unravel. The unity that had been so difficult to build was once again in danger. And yet, in the midst of that new conflict, a figure would emerge who would mark a before and after. A man who would not only consolidate power, but forever reshape the soul of the empire. His name was Constantine. Rome was about to enter a new dimension. It would no longer be merely political or military. It would now also become spiritual. Because what was coming was not just a new dynasty, it was a new religion, and with it, a new way of understanding the world. Constantine and the Christianization of the empire. When the system of the Tetrarchy began to fall apart, it did so with the same speed with which earlier hopes for stability had collapsed. The idea of an empire governed in harmony by 4 men turned out to be too idealistic for human ambition. Each Augustus and each Caesar began to distrust the others. Loyalties fragmented, troops chose their own favorites, and very soon the Roman map turned into a battlefield where legitimacy was no longer earned through titles, but through victories. It was in this climate of uncertainty that a figure emerged who would mark a before and after in the history of the world. Constantine, son of Caesar. Constantius Chlorus, and born on the western fringes of the empire, had something his rivals did not share: a vision for the future. He did not merely aspire to power. He understood that the only way to rebuild Rome was to give it a new story, an identity capable of overcoming centuries of divisions, crises, and civil wars. And he did not find that identity in the old republican customs, nor in the deified figure of the emperor. He found it in a religion that until then had been persecuted. The story of his rise to power is a fascinating mix of political calculation, military charisma, and myth. In the year 312, Constantine faced his main rival in the west, Maxentius. The decisive battle took place near Rome, at the famous Milvian Bridge. According to the chronicles, the night before the battle, Constantine had a vision. In the sky, or in his dreams, the sources vary. A luminous cross appeared, accompanied by a phrase in Greek that said, "In this sign you shall conquer." Upon waking, he ordered that symbol to be painted on the shields of his soldiers. It was the sign of the Christian God. And the next day, he won. Many historians have debated the truth of that vision. Some see it as a later legend, others as a religious interpretation of a natural phenomenon, and others still as a propaganda invention. But in the end, it does not matter whether it happened exactly as told. What matters is that from that moment forward, Constantine chose to embrace Christianity as part of his power, and that would forever change the history of Rome. Shortly after, in the year 313, he issued the Edict of Milan together with Licinius, which legalized the Christian faith and declared religious freedom throughout the empire. It was an unexpected turn, almost unthinkable after centuries of persecution, torture, and executions. Christians who had been sent to the mines, thrown to wild beasts, or burned as human torches were now protected citizens, even favored ones. The change was not only legal, it was ideological, symbolic, and institutional. Constantine did not immediately become a devout Christian. In fact, his baptism took place much later, on his deathbed. But he understood the power of that faith. He saw in it a tool to unify the empire. Traditional Roman religion no longer offered cohesion. Its gods were many, its temples scattered, its cults contradictory. Christianity, by contrast, promised unity, obedience, and community. One faith, one God, one emperor. Thus began a slow but irreversible transformation. Constantine supported the bishops, financed the construction of churches, exempted the clergy from taxes, and allowed ecclesiastical courts to settle civil disputes. He convened the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 with the goal of establishing official doctrine and avoiding internal divisions. Because even though Christianity was already strong, it was far from homogeneous. Theological disputes such as Arianism, which denied the full divinity of Christ, threatened to fragment the new imperial religion. Constantine intervened as an arbiter, as the protector of the faith, not out of devotion, but out of strategy. Meanwhile, he made a decision that would solidify his imperial vision. He founded a new capital. Rome, although eternally symbolic, was no longer functional. It was too rooted in the past, too dominated by senatorial aristocracy, too distant from the real frontiers of power. So, in the year 330, he inaugurated Constantinople on the site of ancient Byzantium, a new, monumental city situated at the crossroads between Europe and Asia. It was the Rome of the future, Christian from birth, designed to reflect the new order. Constantine ruled for more than 3 decades, and during that time Christianity went from being persecuted to being privileged. It was not imposed as the only religion that would happen later under Theodosius, but it grew in influence and presence. The elites began to convert, some out of faith, others out of convenience. Ancient temples lost relevance. Martyrs became saints. Catacombs became places of pilgrimage. The Roman world, without many realizing it at first, began to change its soul. But that change was not smooth. It generated tensions, resistance, and conflict. Many sectors of the empire were still deeply pagan and viewed with suspicion the rise of a religion that rejected the ancestral gods, denied the legitimacy of the imperial cult, and preached a life after death that invalidated earthly glory. The persecutions were not immediately reversed, but new forms of intolerance were already beginning to take shape. Because where there is a single truth, sooner or later comes the urge to impose it. The figure of Constantine remained surrounded by ambiguity. He was a ruthless military man, unafraid to execute members of his own family, including his son Crispus and his wife Fausta, for reasons still shrouded in mystery. He was a pragmatic politician who knew how to exploit every weakness in his rivals. But he was also the architect of a new Rome, the first Christian emperor, the man who opened the doors to a new world without entirely closing those of the old one. His death, in the year 337, marked the beginning of a new dilemma: how to govern an empire divided between pagan heritage and Christian promise. His sons could not maintain unity with the same firmness, and internal conflicts reignited. But the seed had been planted. Religion was no longer a private matter. It had become part of power, in an empire that no longer needed only armies, but shared beliefs. Rome, which for centuries had been the capital of the gods, was beginning to become the capital of the one God. And although it would still take time for Christianity to be established as the only legal faith, its rise was unstoppable. The ancient world was quietly retreating, while a new civilization rose from its ruins. A civilization that still spoke Latin, that still built aqueducts, that still called its emperor Caesar. But that already dreamed of another kind of eternity, an eternity written not with laurels, but with crosses. And it is in that mixture of tradition and rupture, of sword and cross, of marble and gospel, where the world we know today began to take shape. Because Rome did not die, it transformed. The fall of the West. For centuries, the Roman Empire had survived conspiracies, invasions, internal rebellions, and incompetent emperors. It had withstood plagues, economic collapses, territorial divisions, and endless wars. It had known how to transform itself, adapt, and harden. But even the oldest colossi have their limits. And Rome, the eternal, the invincible, the mistress of the Mediterranean, began to crumble not with a bang, but with a slow and weary groan that lasted for generations. The idea of a fall of Rome often evokes dramatic images: barbarians looting the forum, broken statues, temples in flames. But the truth is much more complex. It was not a single day, nor a single event. It was a succession of collapses, a cumulative erosion, an empire that, like a structure too heavy for its worn foundations, began to creak at every corner all at once. Already by the 4th century, the empire was divided in two. Constantinople, the new capital founded by Constantine, had taken center stage in the east, while the west lagged behind, more rural, more vulnerable, and more difficult to govern. And it was there, in that weakened west, where the collapse would begin. External threats were numerous, but one stood out above the rest: the Germanic peoples. Entire tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Suebi, Alans, Burgundians, moved toward the empire's borders, pushed by an enemy even more terrifying than themselves: the Huns. This massive migration triggered a chain reaction. The empire, accustomed to defending a relatively stable frontier, suddenly found itself surrounded by human flows impossible to contain with the exhausted legions of the West. In the year 376, the Visigoths requested refuge from the empire to escape the Huns. They were allowed to cross the Danube, but the treatment they received was so humiliating and cruel that they rebelled. Just 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, Emperor Valens died, along with tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. It was a devastating psychological blow. For the first time in centuries, Rome had been humiliatingly defeated within its own borders, and by an enemy considered barbarian. From that moment on, imperial authority began to waver. Emperors were no longer charismatic figures or powerful military leaders. They were puppets of generals, hostages of the army, marionettes in palace intrigues. Many ruled only for a few years, or even months, before being deposed or assassinated. The prestige of the Roman throne unraveled as the more distant provinces began to act as if they were independent kingdoms. But the most symbolic blow came in the year 410. Rome, the city that had been the capital of the world for nearly 1,000 years, was sacked for the first time by a foreign army. Alaric's Visigoths entered the city not merely as invaders, but as avengers of long-held resentment. They did not destroy everything. In fact, they acted with relative restraint. But the message was clear. Rome was no longer untouchable. The sack of Rome was a collective trauma. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, exclaimed, "If Rome has fallen, what can be safe?" And indeed, Rome was much more than a city. It was the symbolic heart of the empire. Its fall echoed like the herald of a new age. The central pillar had fractured. In the years that followed, other barbarian peoples crossed the line. The Vandals traversed Hispania, crossed into North Africa, and from Carthage built a fleet that in the year 455 dealt another mortal blow, the second sack of Rome. This time the damage was greater, and although Pope Leo I managed to prevent a massacre, the city was systematically looted for 2 weeks. The remaining riches were loaded onto ships, and the temples that still stood were desecrated. Meanwhile, the Roman army in the west was a shadow of its former self. It increasingly recruited troops of barbarian origin, many of whom had no real loyalty to Rome. The high command was filled with Germanic generals who were often more powerful than the emperors themselves. One of them, Ricimer, ruled from behind the throne for more than a decade, appointing and removing emperors as if they were chess pieces. The process was irreversible. The farthest provinces were lost. Britannia was abandoned, Gaul fragmented, and Hispania fell into the hands of Germanic kingdoms. Italy became a vulnerable enclave surrounded by enemies, and the emperor, far from being a respected figure, was now a ceremonial name that few took seriously. And so we arrive at the year 476. The last Roman emperor of the West, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a general of Germanic origin named Odoacer. There was no great battle, no massacre, no epic resistance. It was almost an administrative act. Odoacer sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople as a symbol that an emperor in the West was no longer needed. The Roman throne, once coveted for centuries, was left empty. This gesture is considered by many historians as the official end of the Western Roman Empire. But in reality, what died was not an empire, but its way of governing. Because many Roman structures continued to exist, the cities did not disappear overnight. Latin continued to be spoken. Christianity kept spreading. Roman laws were still respected, even by the Germanic kings. What changed was the idea of unity, of continuity, of imperial eternity. Rome ceased to be a state and became a memory. But a memory so powerful, so persistent, that for centuries many would try to revive it. The Byzantine emperors, the popes of the church, the Germanic kings, all at some point proclaimed themselves heirs of Rome, because Rome had ceased to be a city and had become a civilization. And in that twilight, in that long sunset of the empire, something new was beginning to be born. Europe, a fragmented, violent Europe, but also a creative one. A medieval Europe that, unknowingly, would preserve the ashes of the Roman world to one day, centuries later, reignite them. Because Rome did not fall. Rome transformed into ruin, into memory, into myth. And myth, as the Romans well knew, always survives. Byzantium, the eternal legacy. When the Western Empire faded away amid sackings, barbarian crowns, and dust-covered ruins, many believed that the Roman story had come to an end. But it hadn't. because while thrones were collapsing in Ravenna or Milan, in the paved streets of Constantinople, beneath the golden domes of Hagia Sophia, in the voices of scribes, and in the disciplined armies patrolling the Bosphorus frontier, Rome was still alive. Not in ruins, but transformed. Not in the past, but in a present that reinvented itself with each new emperor. Rome had not died. Rome had relocated. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, was far more than a mere administrative continuation. It was a civilization unto itself, proud of its Latin origins, but profoundly Greek in its soul. For centuries, it resisted the disintegration that had destroyed its western twin. While ephemeral kingdoms rose in the west, Constantinople stood firm as a beacon of stability, power, and wealth, a city fortified by impregnable walls and protected by a diplomatic system as sharp as any sword. Byzantium was Rome, yes, but also something new. In it, Roman law coexisted with Christian theology. Portraits of emperors shared space with icons of saints. Corinthian columns stood alongside Byzantine mosaics. Its administration became more refined, its bureaucracy more labyrinthine, its imperial ritual more sacralized. The emperor was no longer merely the prince of the people. He was the representative of God on earth. The imperial palace became a universe unto itself, where every gesture, every word, every garment carried deep symbolic meaning. The liturgy of power had become an art form. One of the most brilliant moments of this Eastern Rome came under Justinian in the 6th century. His ambition was monumental: to restore the empire's glory, to reclaim the lost lands of the West, to unify the church, and to codify the laws. And to a large extent, he succeeded. His armies, led by the relentless Belisarius, reconquered North Africa, parts of Hispania, and most notably Italy, retaking Rome in a gesture rich with symbolism. At the same time, his legal team compiled the Corpus Juris Civilis, a collection and systematization of Roman law that would influence medieval Europe, the Renaissance, and still echoes in many of today's legal systems. And as if that were not enough, Justinian left behind an architectural testament that continues to overwhelm those who behold it. The Church of Hagia Sophia, domes suspended in midair, light pouring through thousands of windows, a harmony that seemed to come from heaven itself. It was the symbol of an empire that no longer needed to prove its power through conquest, but through beauty, through faith, through permanence. But Byzantium was not only splendor, it was also conflict, religious, internal, and external. Theological disputes over the nature of Christ, the veneration of icons, the authority of the Pope, tore at the church for centuries. The schism with Rome in 1054 was not a sudden rupture, but the culmination of tensions that had been brewing for generations. At heart, it was the clash of two worlds that no longer understood each other. The West was looking to the future, driven by territorial and political ambitions of its own. The East was holding fast to a tradition it refused to let be swept away by Latin Germanic novelty. And then there were the enemies: the Persians, the Arabs, the Bulgars, the Slavs, the Normans, the Turks. Each century brought new threats, but Byzantium endured, sometimes through the cunning of its diplomats, other times through the effectiveness of its gold or the strength of its walls, and when all else failed, through the power of its faith. The empire even survived the blow of the Crusades. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, diverted from its original purpose, sacked Constantinople. It was a tragedy. Libraries destroyed, churches desecrated, relics stolen, citizens massacred. Rome was attacked, this time not by pagan barbarians, but by Western Christians. Byzantium was left fragmented, divided into smaller states, humiliated. And yet, it endured. In 1261, the city was recaptured and the empire restored. In the centuries that followed, Byzantium gradually shrank. It was no longer Justinian's empire. Its territory contracted, its wealth diminished, its influence waned. But its culture, its art, and its wisdom still shone. Constantinople remained a jewel, and its continued existence was crucial, because it was the conduit through which ancient manuscripts, Greek thought, and classical science were transmitted to Europe. It was the bridge between the ancient world and the modern one, and it remained so until the very end. That end came in 1453. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople with a vast army and artillery the likes of which had never been seen. The Byzantines resisted heroically, knowing their defeat would mark the end of an era. And so it was. The city fell. The last emperor, Constantine XI, died with sword in hand, and with him 1,000 years of imperial history came to a close. But curiously, even in death, Byzantium left a legacy. Byzantine scholars fled to the west, bringing with them books, knowledge, and ideas. They settled in Italian cities where the Renaissance was beginning to take shape. And that spark, that flame kindled centuries earlier in the libraries of Alexandria and the forums of Rome, blazed anew. The Roman Empire, in a way, never fully disappeared. It survived in language, in law, in religion, in architecture, in symbols. It survived in the crowns that came after, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the Russian Empire, even in modern republics still inspired by its ideals. Because Rome, at its deepest essence, was never merely a political structure. It was an idea. A civilization that understood power not just as domination, but as permanence, as legacy, as memory. And that memory, even today, is part of who we are. Thus ends the journey. A journey that began with a village in the hills of Latium and concluded with a golden dome reflecting the last rays of sunlight over the waters of the Bosphorus. A story of glory, of blood, of ingenuity, of contradiction. A profoundly human story, and therefore unforgettable. And so concludes this journey through the history of the Roman Empire. If you made it to the end, you're part of that passionate minority who values knowledge and the memory of the past. Let me know in the comments which part impacted you the most, or which figure you'd like to explore in future videos. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for joining me. Good night.